Hello, everyone. Tonight we begin with the thundering heartbeat of an empire. Imagine a world stretched from the misty highlands of Britannia to the blazing sands of Africa, from the Atlantic waves of Iberia to the fertile rivers of Mesopotamia. A world where marble temples cast shadows over muddy alleyways and emperors dream in gold while peasants dream of bread. This is Rome, at its peak, its pride, and its peril. And be warned, once you step into this grandeur, you might not want to leave. Or worse, you might not be able to. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing this little Roman Senate of ours stretch across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin tonight's journey together. At the zenith of its power, the Roman Empire was less of a country and more of a collection of conquered climates, stitched together by ambition, blood, and remarkably efficient road work. It was a place where Latin was the lingua franca, but local dialects, prayers, and curses echoed in every alley. The empire wasn't just big, it was vast in a way that broke maps and strained generals, and at the center of it all, like a marble heart-pumping ambition, was Rome. Rome, the city, the myth, the mess. It buzzed with life, layered with contradiction. Towering columns reached for the gods, while nearby tenements threatened to collapse under their own soot. The air carried the scent of incense and sewage, ambition and armpit, mingling in a bouquet only Rome could produce. Powerful eagles perched atop standards marched across deserts, valleys, and frozen borders, carrying with them the Roman way: law, language, baths, bureaucracy. They brought wine to Gaul, concrete to Carthage, and coins with emperors' faces to places where people still used stones for currency. Whether you were a newly conquered Celt or a seasoned senator, if you lived in the empire, you lived under its wings, willingly or otherwise. This was the age of Augustus's legacy, of imperial festivals, of senators whispering behind closed doors and gladiators roaring in open arenas. It was a time of contradictions so grand they made your local political scandal look like a schoolyard argument. For every invention and marble arch, there was a slave in chains. For every poet reciting Virgil, a farmer cursing the tax collector. And yet, for all its excess, Rome was not just about conquest or corruption. It was a machine, complex, brilliant, brutal, designed to endure. Roads were paved not just with stones, but with planning. Aqueducts snaked like stone arteries across hillsides, delivering clean water to people who thought bathing once a week was practically decadent. Civic pride was real. Romans took being Roman very seriously. If you were a citizen, you were part of the story. If you weren't, well, you could always join the army and hope to survive long enough to earn that golden ticket. Because yes, even if the empire enslaved, taxed, and occasionally crucified, it also offered something rare for the time: a shot at upward mobility, if you were clever, ruthless, or at least fluent in flattery. But all of this, the pride, the marble, the governance, existed against a backdrop of constant tension. The borders were never quiet, the provinces never truly tamed. Uprisings simmered like stew in a poorly watched pot, from Judea to Germania. Governors played gods, emperors feared poison more than barbarians, and somewhere, always, someone was plotting something that involved daggers and dramatically flung togas. Yet within all that, Rome carried on. Because if there was one thing Rome excelled at, besides dramatic collapses, it was surviving. It absorbed cultures like a sponge dipped in wine: Greek gods, Egyptian eyeliner, Persian rugs, all of it Romanized, labeled, taxed, and displayed. Tonight, we stand at that crossroads. Rome at full tilt, an empire in all its messy, magnificent glory. And we're just getting started. Welcome to Rome. Not just the empire, but the city itself. The big, boisterous, beautiful mess that was the capital of everything important, grand, and slightly moldy. Tonight, we wander its streets, not as tourists with guidebooks, but as invisible guests slipping through alleys, peeking past columns, and stepping carefully around horse droppings. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it certainly could trip you in one. At the heart of the empire, Rome pulsed with life, like an overstuffed artery. You didn't walk through Rome, you got swept up by it. The streets didn't just carry traffic, they carried stories. Gladiators brushing past poets, senators arguing over wine prices, bakers yelling over the din while a goat tried to eat someone's tunic. It was chaos, yes, but the kind of chaos that knew its rhythm. Monuments rose like permanent bragging rights, tall, imperious, and always in danger of being photobombed by a beggar or a pigeon. The Forum stood like a marble stage for politics and gossip. The Colosseum, Rome's favorite death and drama dome, loomed in the background, ready to distract even the most focused toga wearer. And scattered throughout, like sprinkles on a very aggressive cake, were public baths, temples, libraries, markets, and homes, if you could call them that. Let's talk architecture, because in Rome, your address said everything. If you were part of the elite, like our fictional friend Lucius Fabius, aged 53, you didn't just live in a house. You inhabited a statement, a villa with an inner courtyard because one yard wasn't enough, walls covered in mosaic stories, and gardens that required a full-time staff of gardeners and statues to maintain. Lucius might wake up to the sound of a lyre playing softly in the atrium, stroll past a fountain shaped like Neptune riding a dolphin, and enjoy breakfast while being fanned by someone who didn't even get a chair. His biggest concern, whether the figs were fresh enough for Senator Tullius, who's visiting later and has opinions about everything. But just a few blocks away, or possibly above him if you're in a multi-tiered neighborhood, the insulae rose like Roman Jenga towers. These were the apartment buildings for the not-so-rich, built quickly, cheaply, and with as much architectural planning as a toddler's block set. They leaned, they creaked, they burned. A lot. Our second character tonight is Decimus Livius, aged 29, who lives on the 4th floor of one such insula. That's not as glamorous as it sounds. First, there are no elevators. Second, the 4th floor might as well be a mile high when you're carrying jugs of water or trying to avoid eye contact with the guy on the 2nd floor who breeds pigeons indoors. Decimus shares his one-room space with 2 brothers, a cousin who overstayed his visit by 3 years, and a cat that may or may not belong to anyone. His walls are made of something that looks like plaster but smells like regret. The ceiling leaks when it rains, which is most inconvenient since the floor also leaks when it doesn't. Still, he's lucky. Some insulae collapsed from sheer pessimism. Others caught fire when someone lit a lamp too close to a curtain that hadn't been washed since Augustus was a teenager. Fire brigades existed technically, but let's just say they responded more like philosophers than firefighters. Lots of debate, not much action. The streets of Rome were alive. Not metaphorically, literally pulsing with the sound of sandals on stone, oxen hooves clattering, and the never-ending bartering of merchants. Markets spilled into every spare corner. Spices, scrolls, seafood that had seen better days. You could buy honey, silk, or a curse tablet, depending on what kind of day you were having. Rome smelled like ambition, marinated in fish sauce. The air was a cocktail of roasting meat, incense smoke, unwashed humanity, and whatever the Tiber felt like delivering that day. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar. Romans didn't expect fresh air. They expected air with character. In this vibrant jungle of stone and sweat, public spaces reigned supreme. The bathhouses weren't just about hygiene. They were about status, socializing, and sometimes spying. Imagine a giant marble co-working space where everyone's naked and the water's slightly too warm. You could discuss politics, finalize business deals, or just gossip about who got caught sneaking out of whose villa. Temples were everywhere, because in Rome, there was a god for everything. If you tripped on the stairs, you could blame it on the god of thresholds. Lost your sandal? Offer a coin to Mercury. Feeling unlucky? There's probably a shrine to Fortuna just around the corner, next to the wine shop, naturally. But even amidst this grandeur, there was quiet. Rome wasn't all noise and parade. Tucked between the shouting vendors and echoing columns were moments of peace. A shady garden, a library scroll room, a small fountain murmuring in Latin. It was here that people like Claudia Tertia, a 22-year-old household slave, might steal a few moments of breath between tasks. Claudia spent her days preparing meals, carrying water, and trying to avoid her mistress's endless demands. Her world was defined by corridors, curt orders, and careful silence. But in those rare pauses, when the courtyard was empty and the sun filtered through the fig leaves, she might sit for a moment, breathe, and remember the name of her village. The city, after all, wasn't just for the powerful. It was made real by the people who carried it. The stonemasons, the bakers, the children selling figs. People like Gaius Domitianus, 37, a potter whose hands were always coated in clay and whose back ached with every coin he didn't earn. He worked from sunrise to sunset, selling wares in a market stall that doubled as shelter from the rain and the tax collector. Rome was contrast made visible. It was marble next to mud, poetry next to shouting, law next to loophole. It was a city where a senator could quote Horace at a banquet while a child down the alley begged for bread. And yet, it worked. Somehow. Through bureaucracy, baths, belief systems, and a deeply ingrained fear of disappointing their ancestors, Romans kept the machine running. But don't get too comfortable. Rome might impress you with her arches and forums, but remember, behind every column is a story, and behind every story, a mess. That's the beauty of Rome. It dazzles you with perfection and then reminds you it was built by very flawed, very real people. And tomorrow, as we dive deeper, we'll meet the ones who truly kept this empire breathing. The thinkers, the dreamers, and the dangerously ambitious. But for now, sleep well under your hypothetical Roman stars, preferably with a hand on your coin pouch. Let's step inside one of those grand homes we mentioned earlier, the kind that echoes when you whisper and echoes even louder when you try to sneak a snack at midnight. Tonight, we visit the domus of Lucius Fabius, 53 years old, wealthy, respectable, and just a little too proud of his imported Greek statues. His home isn't merely a place to sleep. It's a carefully curated exhibit of taste, power, and look how rich I am energy. Picture a sprawling villa nestled near the Palatine Hill. The entrance opens into an atrium where sunlight filters through an opening in the roof, spotlighting a small pool meant to collect rainwater, and also compliments from guests. The floor is a mosaic of swirling dolphins chasing one another, possibly to distract visitors from the fact that Lucius hasn't updated his decor since the reign of Tiberius. Marble busts line the walls. One of them might be a relative, or a Greek philosopher, or just a guy with a good nose. No one's quite sure, but Lucius nods sagely when asked. His home smells faintly of fresh laurel, old scrolls, and a perfume so expensive it has its own inheritance. Meals here aren't just meals. They're performances. There are slaves for cooking, slaves for serving, and sometimes even slaves to fan the air while you chew. Guests recline on couches, because chairs are apparently for people without family trees. They sip wine watered down because being drunk before the second course is just tacky, and nibble olives with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for war declarations. Conversation is the main course. Politics, poetry, philosophy, and the latest gossip about who embarrassed themselves at the forum. Lucius prides himself on being well-read, often quoting Virgil or Seneca mid-bite, sometimes in the correct context. But beneath the laughter and toasts lies something quieter: calculation. Every guest, every dish, every syllable is a move in the social chessboard. Lucius isn't just entertaining. He's reinforcing alliances, soothing egos, and very subtly reminding everyone that he can afford a whole amphora of imported garum without blinking. Meanwhile, across town, or in another world entirely, Gaius Domitianus is preparing his evening in a slightly different fashion. His day as a potter has ended with sore arms, a few coins, and clay under his nails that no amount of scrubbing will remove. His home, if you can call it that, is a rented room behind a workshop. The walls sweat in the summer and shiver in the winter, and the roof groans like it's debating whether today is the day it collapses. Dinner is simpler here. A bowl of lentils, maybe some bread hardened into a potential building material. Gaius eats with his fingers because forks haven't been invented yet, and even if they had, they'd be considered suspiciously fancy. There's no table talk about Aristotle or imperial taxes. Instead, there's the clink of bowls, the occasional sigh, and maybe a muttered complaint about how the new clay shipment was full of pebbles. Gaius doesn't quote philosophers. He quotes his landlord, usually with more sarcasm than reverence. But here's the twist. In their own ways, both Lucius and Gaius are doing the same thing, navigating the intricate maze of Roman society. One uses wit and wine, the other uses grit and stubbornness. One has marble columns, the other has wooden beams held up by prayer. Yet both understand Rome's unspoken rule: stay useful, stay cautious, and try not to annoy anyone who owns a scroll. And then there's Claudia Tertia. Remember her? 22, sharp-eyed, and technically someone else's property. She serves in Lucius's household, which means her days are long, her nights short, and her free time theoretical. She wakes before the sun, prepares food she'll never eat, cleans rooms she'll never rest in, and listens to conversations where her name is never mentioned. But Claudia is no silent shadow. She knows who argues behind closed doors, who owes whom a favor, and which guest always drops crumbs down his tunic. She has a mental map of the villa more detailed than any architect's drawing, and an instinct for when to speak and when to vanish. At night, when the villa finally quiets, she sometimes slips out to the garden. Just for a minute. Just long enough to feel the cool stone under her feet and remember what silence feels like. She doesn't dream of escape. That's for stories. She dreams of a better position, perhaps as a personal attendant, where she might get a room of her own, with a curtain, maybe even a stool. Because in Rome, even ambition comes in tiers. Rome's population wasn't just divided by wealth. It was segmented by function. Everyone had a role, and stepping outside that role was risky business. The senators governed, the equestrians managed business, the plebeians worked, and the slaves, well, they did everything else. This layered society operated like a theater. There were masks, roles, scripts. Deviate too far, and the audience or the emperor might not be amused. Yet the system worked, in its own peculiar, precarious way, because everyone believed in the play, even if some were only allowed to sweep the stage. And speaking of belief, let's not forget the gods. They were everywhere, literally. Carved into walls, painted on urns, perched atop every other building, Jupiter, Juno, Mars, and Mercury, like a divine reality show where every episode ends in a lightning bolt. Every Roman, from Lucius to Claudia, performed rituals, small ones daily, offerings of incense, whispered prayers, a quick nod toward a household shrine before leaving home. Not because they were devout, well, some were, but because not doing it might mean inviting chaos. And Rome had enough of that already. Religion in Rome wasn't just faith. It was duty, tradition, and community insurance. You made your offerings, not because you expected blessings, but to avoid attention. The gods were like imperial officials, better appeased than angered. So each night, as the city wound down and oil lamps flickered to life, you'd find Rome slowly catching its breath. In the villa, Lucius recited a few lines to Vesta. In the workshop, Gaius muttered something to Fortuna while hiding his last coin. And in the servant quarters, Claudia lit a stolen candle, closed her eyes, and prayed. Not to a god, but to tomorrow. Because in this grand, creaking, glorious empire, tomorrow always came with a price. Sleep well, Roman citizen or future one. You'll need your strength. We've only just begun. By now, you might think life in Rome was all grandeur or grind, marble columns for the lucky, cracked clay walls for everyone else. But don't worry, the empire had a little something for every kind of exhaustion. Tonight, we leave the warm comforts, or scratchy inconveniences of Roman beds, and explore what truly kept this empire breathing. Its people. Not just their jobs, their gods, or their mosaics of dolphins doing backflips. No, we're talking about their daily rhythms, the things they did between sunup and sundown to survive, to rise, to remain Roman. Let's begin with politics. Not the screaming on forum steps kind you see in historical dramas, although there was plenty of that. We're talking about the machinery. Rome didn't run on virtue. It ran on paperwork, patronage, and a web of favors so tangled even the gods gave up trying to track them. Take Lucius Fabius, our 53-year-old social climber in a senator's toga. His day starts before most roosters finish stretching. He's not awake because he loves the dawn. He's awake because it takes a full hour to get his hair to look accidentally tousled. After a brief breakfast, some bread, a fig, and a complaint about the cost of Egyptian linen, Lucius sets off to the Curia, the Senate House, a place filled with older men and even older grudges. Inside, senators debate matters of war, trade, taxes, and the latest reason to be slightly offended by Greece. The speeches are long, the logic often flexible, and the applause highly rehearsed. Deals are whispered behind marble columns while officially decrying corruption in loud voices. Lucius doesn't always speak, but when he does, he gestures with practiced flair, like a man who's been rehearsing his points with a wine jug. He argues for tax reform, subtly benefits his friends, and pretends he didn't notice when someone slipped a coin purse under his seat. But politics isn't just for the powerful. Even the plebeians, Rome's everyday citizens, had their assemblies. And yes, it looked a bit like early democracy. Everyone shouting, hands raised, sometimes voting on laws, sometimes arguing over whether last night's race was rigged. Spoiler, it probably was. People like Gaius Domitianus, the potter, might not have had a say in imperial policies, but in local matters. Street maintenance, grain rations, or whether the butcher's scales were rigged, they had opinions, loud ones, and weren't afraid to share them. Meanwhile, far from the noisy assemblies and perfumed senate halls, Claudia Tertia continues her day. After sweeping the triclinium, the Roman dining room, now empty of reclining men and full of crumbs, she prepares linens, polishes bronzeware, and dodges the occasional flirtation from the younger steward, who smells permanently of olives and ambition. She knows her place in the household and in the empire. She also knows every shortcut between the kitchen and the garden, which doors creak, the left pantry, and that Lucius secretly hates anchovies, despite praising them in front of guests. Claudia may not hold a title, but in the silent economy of the villa, her knowledge is gold. If she's lucky, she gets a few minutes at the end of her chores to visit the household lararium, the little shrine to the household gods. She lights incense, whispers thanks for not tripping over her own sandals today, and perhaps makes a silent wish, nothing big, maybe just a quiet evening or bread without weevils. Back outside, the city is alive with movement. Rome's infrastructure, for all its splendor, is also a daily test of patience. Traffic isn't just ox carts and foot traffic. It's also processions, public punishments, and the occasional runaway goat. Streets are narrow, stone-paved, and occasionally aromatic, thanks to the practice of emptying chamber pots with a quick shout of caveat and a dump out the window. Water comes from aqueducts, magnificent elevated stone channels that bring water into the city from miles away. But don't get too excited. Most people fetch it in jars, wait in line, and carry it home like it's sacred. Baths may be public and plentiful, but someone still has to haul the water, heat the fire, and scrub the benches, likely someone like Claudia. And then there's education. If you were a Roman boy in a respectable family, your day might include lessons in reading, writing, and rhetoric. Latin and Greek, of course, because what's the point of philosophy if you can't quote it pretentiously? Girls? Depends on your family. Some learned at home, others not at all. But learning wasn't just for the rich. In Rome, public speeches were everywhere. The Forum was a constant lecture, market squares hosted debates, and even bathhouses echoed with the sounds of someone misquoting Cicero. Rome taught by exposure, if not by design, then by sheer volume. By afternoon, most work winds down. Shops close, citizens nap. It's hot after all, and no one likes debating over a bowl of melting cheese. But as the sun lowers, Rome wakes again. It's time for entertainment. And no, we're not heading to the Colosseum just yet. Tonight, it's all about the streets. Street performers juggle, sing, or reenact plays with props that have seen better centuries. Vendors call out the virtues of wine, garum, and cakes so dry they double as roof tiles. Children chase one another between columns. Musicians strum lutes, flutes, and instruments that sound like a goat falling down a hill. It's loud, crowded, and wonderfully alive. Gaius might treat himself to a cup of wine. Diluted, yes, but still better than water that smells like regret. He leans on a post, listens to a bard exaggerate a battle, and maybe, just maybe, smiles. It's not peace, but it's enough. And somewhere nearby, Claudia ends her day. She lights the evening lamp, checks the bread dough for tomorrow, and makes sure no rats have claimed the pantry again. She shares a few quiet words with the cook, accepts a crust of leftover bread, and slips outside to the edge of the garden wall. There's a breeze tonight. She closes her eyes and pretends it carries the sound of the sea. Rome never truly sleeps. Even at night, fires burn, patrols march, prayers are whispered, and lovers argue over statues that look suspiciously like their exes. But for a moment, in the hush between duties, the city sighs. Tomorrow the empire will stir again. The Senate will scheme, the slaves will serve, the merchants will haggle, and the gods, those tireless, decorative eavesdroppers, will continue to watch. So for now, close your eyes. You're not Lucius or Gaius or Claudia, but tonight you were with them. And that's enough. Sleep well, Rome will wait. Tonight, let's enter the most dramatic, bloodless battlefield of Roman life, the public spectacle, where sandals met sand, and reputations could rise or fall faster than a chariot going downhill without brakes. You've had your daily politics, your gritty bread, your 2 sips of wine dinner, Now it's time for what the Romans truly loved, sitting shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other strangers and watching people get publicly humiliated for fun. We begin with the grandest of them all, the Colosseum, or as it was known back then, the Flavian Amphitheater, a name only used by people trying to sound smarter than they actually were. It could seat around 50,000 people, give or take a few, who were accidentally trampled in the rush for better seats. Let's say Lucius Fabius is there tonight. Of course he is. He's a senator. He gets the best spot, high enough to avoid smelling the lions, low enough to let everyone else smell his cologne. He arrives late on purpose so that everyone notices. His toga is immaculate, his expression one of calculated boredom. He's seen it all before. He wants you to know that. Meanwhile, somewhere in the upper levels, very upper levels, Gaius Domitianus is also there. He's crammed between a cabbage vendor and someone who may or may not be alive. His view? Let's just say it's more the back of someone's head than arena floor. But it doesn't matter. The energy is electric. People cheer, shout, bet, and occasionally throw snacks, mostly at each other. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena. It was social theater. Gladiators fought, yes, but so did ideologies, politics, and the empire's very image. These events were staged, funded, and fiercely managed. A good show meant good PR for the sponsor, usually some rich politician trying to win favor with the crowd. A bad show meant the crowd might throw more than just insults. Today's event is a classic, man versus beast. And by beast, we don't mean your mother-in-law. We mean actual lions, tigers, bears, maybe even elephants, imported at great cost and little concern for logistics. They'd roar, charge, and then usually lose because, well, the Romans liked their victories neat and patriotic. Gladiators came next. Contrary to popular belief, not all fights were to the death. These were investments, trained professionals. Killing them off too quickly was like smashing your phone after one text. Instead, matches were choreographed chaos, blades clashing, blood spurting just enough for drama, and always ending with a dramatic pause as the victor waited for the emperor's thumb. Thumbs up meant spare him. Thumbs down? Well, that depended on the emperor's mood, the crowd's bloodlust, and whether the loser had embarrassed himself by tripping over his own sword. And then there were the intermissions. No popcorn, but you could buy sausage on a stick, flatbread, or honey cakes. Children ran up and down the steps, nobles whispered about politics, and someone inevitably complained about the quality of the last execution. Too fast, they'd say, sipping watered wine. No suspense. Of course, not everyone liked the Colosseum. Claudia Tertia, for example, has never been. She's a slave. Days off don't exist in her world. She only hears about it through scraps of gossip from visiting guests or a drunk kitchen steward reenacting scenes with a ladle. Instead, Claudia's spectacle is the bathhouse. Not to bathe. Her time there is short and strictly supervised, but to serve. She brings towels, collects discarded sandals, and sometimes just listens. Because bathhouses, like the arena, were where Rome revealed itself. Just a little less covered in dust and slightly more covered in steam. Bathing was a full ritual. You undressed in front of everyone, moved from warm room to hot room to cold plunge, and then oiled yourself up before scraping it all off with a strigil, a curved metal blade that turned dirt into performance art. There was no soap, but there was plenty of conversation. Politics, gossip, philosophical debates shouted between sweaty senators. This was the real Roman networking. And Claudia, quiet and quick, absorbed it all. She knew which patrician was trying to buy a new estate, which magistrate had an embarrassing foot fungus, and who loudly decried immorality while scheduling evening visits to courtesans. For many Romans, entertainment wasn't confined to buildings. The streets themselves offered daily drama. Musicians played, jugglers juggled. Fortune tellers promised vague doom, and if you were lucky, you might witness a minor public shaming, someone chained to a post for tax evasion or loudly denounced for selling watered-down wine. Even religious festivals turned into public performance. The Feast of Saturnalia was basically ancient Rome's version of anything goes. Slaves sat at the table, masters served them, with varying degrees of sincerity, and everyone wore silly hats and exchanged joke gifts. It was both wild fun and a deeply calculated way to let people blow off steam so they wouldn't revolt the next day. Rome understood something modern cities often forget. People need spectacle. Whether in marble arenas, smoky taverns, or crowded forums, Romans sought moments to gasp, to laugh, to forget the daily grind. And the empire, ever pragmatic, made sure to supply just enough bread and circus to keep things stable. Back in the upper tiers of the Colosseum, Gaius leans forward. A charioteer has just been thrown from his cart. The crowd surges with noise. Lucius, down in his velvet-lined seat, doesn't flinch, but he's watching intently. Everyone is. The games aren't just distraction, they're metaphor. They remind Romans who they are: conquerors, survivors, storytellers who never say no to a little drama. And so the chariots race, the beasts roar, the gladiators bleed carefully, and the empire watches itself reflected in sand and sweat. Somewhere, a scribe notes down the winners. Somewhere else, a vendor shouts the price of mulled wine. And far away, Claudia cleans the silver goblets the guests will use later tonight to toast the games. She doesn't need to see the arena. She hears it in their voices, the thrill, the hunger, the fleeting joy. Rome may have many gods, but tonight, the loudest one is spectacle. And like all Roman deities, it demands worship. Sleep now, little spectator. Tomorrow, the empire plays again. Tonight, we shift our focus from the roar of the arena to something just as powerful, just as all-consuming, but far less theatrical: Roman religion. Now, don't expect sacred silence or serene temples lit by soft candlelight. Religion in ancient Rome wasn't gentle. It was woven into everything: noisy, public, occasionally confusing, and almost always a group activity with more sacrifices than subtlety. Let's begin at home. Inside the modest but respectable villa of Lucius Fabius, the day doesn't officially begin until he greets the household gods. No, not just with a nod. This is a full production. In a small shrine, usually tucked near the kitchen or the atrium, stand tiny statues called Lares and Penates. Think of them as the spiritual HOA of Roman family life. They watched over the pantry, the family's health, and probably judged your wine selection. Lucius stands before them in his cleanest tunic, a slave trailing behind with a dish of salted flour. He sprinkles the offering, mutters a prayer, and lights a bit of incense. The smoke curls upward toward the open roof above, carrying his hopes for good health, a quiet Senate session, and maybe fewer pigeons defiling the courtyard statue of Mars. These rituals aren't optional. They're how you keep the gods from noticing you in a bad way. In Rome, the gods weren't all loving or forgiving. They were powerful, moody, and required regular maintenance. Skip a ritual? Forget an offering? That's not just bad luck. It's practically an invitation for chaos. Public religion is even louder. Walk through the forum on any given day, and you might trip over a procession. Priests in tall, oddly festive hats lead crowds through the streets. Musicians play instruments that sound like angry ducks. Someone is carrying a sacred chicken. No one questions this. It's Rome. Sacred poultry is a thing. Temples dot the city, like gods had a real estate agent, each one dedicated to a specific deity. Jupiter, the thunder-wielding king of the gods; Mars, the god of war and loud opinions; Venus, goddess of love and well-placed side eyes; and dozens of others: Minerva, Neptune, Diana, Vesta, each with their own cult, feast days, and expectations. Even people like Gaius Domitianus, the potter, who barely has enough denarii to buy lunch, takes religion seriously. Before opening his stall, he pours a splash of wine on the ground, just a little, to honor Mercury, god of commerce. It's not about devotion, it's about survival. You don't need the gods' attention, you need their indifference, which in Roman terms is a blessing. Religious life in Rome wasn't about belief, it was about practice. Orthopraxy over orthodoxy. Do the right things in the right way, and you were considered pious. Whether you actually believed the gods were watching was your business. Just don't mess up the ritual in public. And then there's the Vestal Virgins. Rome's elite priestesses, guardians of the sacred flame of Vesta. They lived in a grand house next to the Forum, kept the eternal fire burning, and had more legal privileges than most women in Rome. But the job came with strings, like 30 years of chastity, constant surveillance, and a one-way ticket to being buried alive if they broke their vows. Still, some girls dreamed of becoming one. Not for the glamour, but for the power. In a society where most women were defined by marriage and motherhood, being a Vestal meant independence, prestige, and a palace that didn't smell like turnips. Back in Lucius's villa, the evening brings another ritual. A guest arrives, another senator, let's call him Marcus Calvus, and before dinner begins, they pause at the lararium. A small offering, a polite prayer, a nod to the divine. Then it's on to the wine and the gossip and the part where someone inevitably brags about their son's oratory skills. Claudia Tertia, attending quietly with a jug of watered wine, watches the whole scene unfold. She isn't allowed to participate, but she's memorized every word of the household prayer. She mouths it silently, just in case. Her own gods, the ones from her childhood village far beyond Rome, don't have shrines here. But she lights a small oil lamp in the servants' quarters when she can, a private ritual, a borrowed moment. Because Rome, for all its power, is full of borrowed beliefs. Conquer a new land, steal their gods. Egypt, Greece, the East all brought their deities to Rome's temples. Isis from Egypt had her own cult. Mithras, a mysterious Persian god of soldiers and secret handshakes, had underground temples lit by torchlight and riddled with initiation rituals so elaborate you'd think they were planning a surprise party for eternity. Romans didn't just tolerate this mix, they embraced it. Religion was a buffet as long as you didn't mess with the main course, the emperor. Ah, yes, the imperial cult. Worshipping the emperor wasn't optional. Sure, it started with polite reverence for Augustus, who cleverly avoided calling himself a god while encouraging everyone else to do so. But by the time of Domitian or Caligula, the line between man and divine was not just blurry, it was aggressively ignored. Temples to emperors stood alongside those to Jupiter. Sacrifices were made in their honor, statues were kissed, garlands placed, incense burned. Lucius did it with the flair of a man who knew the emperor's spies were always watching. Gaius did it quickly, quietly, and with fingers crossed behind his back. And Claudia? She just watched. Always watching. She saw the difference between faith and performance, between devotion and duty, between what people did for the gods and what they did because Rome demanded it. Religion in Rome was a mirror, not just to the divine, but to the empire itself, vast, contradictory, layered, and always watching. So tonight, as the lamps flicker out across the city, from the glowing braziers of the temple steps to the stubby candles in the insulae, Romans of every class whisper their final prayers. Some to Jupiter, some to Mars, some, like Claudia, to gods without names. Not because they expect miracles, but because hope, like Rome itself, is stubborn. Now rest. Tomorrow brings new omens, new rituals, and perhaps, if the gods are bored, a little divine drama. Tonight, we slip away from temples and into something far more intimate, the Roman household. And before you start picturing warm fires, cozy dinners, and family game night, ancient edition, let's set expectations straight. A Roman household was not just where people slept, it was a mini-empire, with its own ruler, laws, class system, and yes, an alarmingly high chance of being judged by your furniture. At the head of it all stood the paterfamilias, the male head of the family. In our ongoing tale, that's Lucius Fabius. 53, graying but still insisting it's distinguished and legally the most powerful person in his home, which means he could arrange marriages, disown children, sell family members into slavery, theoretically, and command respect through a well-arched eyebrow alone. To be clear, this wasn't just about ego. The paterfamilias was legally responsible for everyone under his roof, not just his wife and children, but also his slaves, freedmen, adopted relatives, and that one cousin who's been between jobs since the reign of Claudius. If someone messed up, Lucius answered for it. It was part patriarch, part manager, part reluctant babysitter. Inside his villa, Lucius moves like a general. Morning meetings with estate stewards, midday discussions with tutors about his son's progress in rhetoric. He quotes Cicero but can't fold a toga. What use is that? Evening lectures on morals over dinner. No one asked for them, but no one interrupts either. And then there's his wife, Julia Calpurnia, 35, sharp as a senator and twice as patient. Officially, she's not in charge. Unofficially, she runs the household like a finely tuned war machine. Menus, guest lists, dowries, linens, gossip, intel, all pass through her hands. She can calculate the value of a silk tunic just by touch and negotiate with fishmongers like they're at the Treaty of Brundisium. Roman women couldn't vote or hold office, but the smart ones, like Julia, found power in proximity. She reads philosophy, writes letters to other elite women, and subtly reminds Lucius which senators have terribly behaved sons. She also manages the slaves, though manages is a polite word. She commands, corrects, and occasionally compliments if the silverware sparkles just right. Their children, if they have any, are on a strict schedule. Lessons, exercise, learning how not to embarrass the family in public. A Roman child's first words might be, "Don't speak unless spoken to," followed closely by, "Always remember your ancestors." But the real machinery of the house? That's the slaves. Dozens of them in Lucius's case, each with a role so specific you'd think they were hired by a very picky casting director. Cook, cleaner, door guard, letter carrier, lamplighter, reader, scribe, tutor. Some even manage other slaves. It's a hierarchy within a hierarchy, and at the bottom, always someone like Claudia Tercia. Claudia, 22, has been here since she was 16. Sold into the household after a financial collapse in her village, she started in the kitchens, graduated to serving guests, and now helps manage laundry and linens, mostly because she's fast, quiet, and doesn't flinch when someone yells. She has her own routines: wake before sunrise, check the water jugs, iron tunics with hot stones, and try not to look tired around Julia. She's seen other slaves dismissed for less, or worse, sent to the countryside estates where the work is brutal and the winters unforgiving. Still, within the rigid structure of Roman household life, Claudia finds small pockets of control. She knows who favors which wine. She knows Lucius's weak spot for almond pastries. She knows when Julia is about to ask for something and already has it in hand. That kind of foresight, priceless. Now, not every Roman lived like this. Let's cross the city to the fourth floor of a leaning insula where Gaius Domitianus, the potter, lives with his extended family. Here, the paterfamilias role is less about law and more about who's best at keeping the roof from collapsing. Gaius, 37, earns just enough to keep everyone fed and occasionally argues with his sister over whose turn it is to fetch water. His authority is respected in the same way one respects the guy who always fixes the broken stool. Practical, unglamorous, necessary. His household includes his widowed sister, 2 nephews, and a cousin who insists he's starting a new trade any day now. The apartment is cramped. They sleep on mats rolled out at night and cook over a clay stove that smokes like it's auditioning for a volcano roll. Despite the simplicity, there's pride. A small statue of Mercury watches over the room. Dried herbs hang from the beams. Gaius has saved enough to buy a real mattress, straw-filled, yes, but still a step up from the floor. Daily life is a blur of noise and needs. Someone is always shouting. A pot always needs fixing. Bread always needs baking, and yet there's laughter. There are inside jokes. There's shared silence at the end of a long day. In a way, it's as Roman as Lucius's marble columns. What unites all Roman households, regardless of status, is structure. Clear roles, unspoken rules, constant movement. Whether you're serving honey-glazed dormice or boiled lentils, someone's organizing the effort behind it. And above it all, the weight of expectation. Be dutiful, be respectable, be Roman. But even in this strict world, there are cracks, moments of tenderness. A slave girl slipping extra olives to a hungry child, a father pausing mid-lecture to ruffle his son's hair, a potter sharing his last piece of cheese with a sick nephew. Small rebellions of kindness in an empire obsessed with order. So tonight, as the city's households settle into their routines, lamps extinguished, prayers whispered, shutters closed, the Roman family rests, not always peacefully, not always happily, but always together, beneath the same stars in the same empire. Tomorrow, the paterfamilias will rise again, the wheels will turn, the gods will watch, and somewhere Claudia will fold a sheet so perfectly that even Julia Calpurnia will pause, nod, and say nothing, which, in Roman high society, is the highest praise there is. Sleep now, little citizen. Tomorrow, the household stirs again. Tonight, we peel back the layers of Roman life even further, this time to the heartbeat of its economy and survival: labor. Not the kind that wins applause or gets a statue. We're talking about the grinding, splintered, sunburned work that built aqueducts, carved temples, harvested wheat, and occasionally held up roofs with sheer willpower and bad luck. Let's begin with the city's workforce. Rome didn't just run on senators and scholars, it ran on hands. Millions of them. Calloused, cracked, blistered hands. And behind those hands were people like Gaius Domitianus, our 37-year-old potter, whose life is a never-ending battle against soggy clay, late payments, and neighbors who borrow his tools indefinitely. Gaius wakes before dawn, not because he's a morning person, but because the kiln takes hours to heat, and he needs daylight to dry the new batch of bowls that will hopefully not crack this time. He shares a workshop with two other artisans, one who's always singing and one who's always late. It's a symphony of scraping, firing, shouting, and occasionally dodging an exploding amphora. His job isn't glamorous, but it is essential. Romans need pots for everything, storing grain, wine, olive oil, fish sauce, which smells like sin, and occasionally burying small household curses. Without people like Gaius, Roman pantries would be chaos, and dinner would be spilled on the floor. But the city isn't just clay and commerce. There's marble to cut, roads to repair, lead pipes to shape. Yes, lead, because future health risks wasn't a thing. There are bakers, butchers, street cleaners, water carriers, and the guy who yells the time from a rooftop with questionable accuracy. Each job came with a risk: injury, illness, or worst of all, irate clients. And then there are the guilds, Rome's professional clubs. Think of them as ancient unions, but with more togas and less dental coverage. They organized trades, set prices, and provided a safety net if, say, your roof tile business was crushed by actual roof tiles. Gaius belongs to one. He pays his dues, attends the meetings, nods solemnly, and wonders if anyone actually reads the minutes. Now, while Gaius is shaping jugs, let's check on Claudia Tertia, who, spoiler alert, is not shaping jugs, unless it's to carry them 3 floors up with no breaks. Claudia's labor is unpaid and legally invisible. She's a slave, and that means her job is everything. She wakes before her masters, prepares their breakfast, cleans their rooms, mends their tunics, fetches water, scrubs the atrium, tends to the lamp oil, and somehow still finds time to arrange the guest seating so no one's insulted by proximity to the cheese board. It's exhausting, repetitive, and performed under the constant threat of being sold, reassigned, or replaced. Slavery in Rome wasn't just a condition, it was an economy, a system so embedded that entire industries relied on it. Claudia's labor enables Lucius's comfort, just like the hundreds of others who cook, build, farm, and write for free. Yes, write. Some slaves were educated, often more than their owners. Scribes, tutors, doctors, all technically property. Imagine being the most knowledgeable person in the room and still needing permission to speak. Welcome to Rome. But not all slaves stayed that way. Some were freed, granted manumission as a reward for loyalty, skill, or sheer luck. Freedmen like Publius Severus, 46, once a household steward, now runs a small book copying business. He can't run for office, but he can own property, earn wealth, and live in constant fear of being reminded where he came from. His business depends on demand from people like Lucius Fabius, who commissions scrolls to stock his home library and impress guests who pretend to read. Publius hires scribes, some free, some not, to copy texts at a pace that would make modern interns faint. Every mistake is corrected with careful scraping. Every scroll is precious, and every denarius earned is a step further from the past. Meanwhile, in the countryside, Rome's agricultural engine groans on. Vast estates owned by absentee landlords are worked by slaves and tenant farmers. Grain, olives, grapes, the staples of Roman diet, are grown under the watch of overseers who are better with whips than words. It's backbreaking labor under a sun that does not care about harvest quotas. And it's not just men. Women work too, at home, in markets, in laundries, in taverns. They mend clothes, grind grain, sell herbs, and manage children while bartering with a fishmonger who swears the sea bass is fresh, even though it looks slightly haunted. Labor is survival, and no one escapes it. Even Lucius Fabius, in his polished sandals, is a kind of laborer. His work is politics, writing letters, courting allies, remembering birthdays of influential people he doesn't like. It's less sweaty than carrying amphorae, but the stakes are still high. One social misstep and suddenly you're out of favor, like out of office, and very possibly out of dinner invites. Rome's economy was a living beast, complex, hungry, and constantly evolving. It rewarded cleverness, punished weakness, and made no promises. Fortune smiled, but never guaranteed a second date. And yet, amidst all this toil, there is pride. Gaius runs his fingers over a finished pot and nods. Claudia folds a tunic so precisely it could stand on its own. Publius corrects a poorly copied Caesar and mutters, "Amateurs." Even Lucius, while dictating a speech he won't deliver himself, allows a flicker of satisfaction. The gears turn. The empire breathes. Because in Rome, work was not just necessity, it was identity. Who you were, how you lived, and how you were remembered all depended on what you did. And in a world without resumes or LinkedIn, your reputation was your legacy. So sleep now, weary laborer of past or present. Whether your hands shaped clay, counted scrolls, or just applauded from the cheap seats, Rome remembers, sort of, occasionally, especially if your name fit nicely on a plaque. Tomorrow, the city wakes, and the work begins again. Tonight, we step outside the bustling Roman markets, away from the steaming bathhouses and shouting senators, and into something both quieter and far more dangerous: Roman medicine. Or, as it was often experienced, guesswork wrapped in herbs, hope, and a concerning amount of cabbage. Let's start with the basics. If you lived in Rome and got sick, the first thing you did was panic slightly. Because unless you were wealthy, lucky, or already dying in a dramatic way, your options were limited. There were doctors, yes, but qualifications ranged from trained in Alexandria to once saw a goat get better on its own. Lucius Fabius, our silver-haired senator with a fondness for theatrical toasts, had the best care money could buy. His personal physician, Dr. Antiochus, was a Greek freedman with impeccable grooming, suspicious confidence, and an ever-present vial of something that smelled like regret and vinegar. Dr. Antiochus practiced a blend of observation, old scrolls, and creative interpretations of Galenic theory. Got a fever? Let's balance your humors. Bleeding? Let's bleed you more. Makes sense if you squint. Coughing? Must be the spleen, or perhaps bad air, or possibly the gods. Either way, here's some boiled fennel and a prayer to Apollo. Still, Lucius trusted him, because medicine, like politics, was as much about performance as results. Dr. Antiochus always arrived with urgency, scribbled notes in Greek, and gave stern orders like more garlic or no figs until the moon wanes. He never explained why. That was part of the charm. Meanwhile, across the Tiber, Gaius Domitianus has a different approach. His physician is a neighborhood widow who sells poultices made of crushed leeks, burnt wool, and something she refuses to identify. Her motto? If it stings, it's working. Gaius doesn't ask questions. He can't afford them. When his joints ache, he wraps them in hot cloths, mutters something rude about the weather, and drinks wine until he forgets which leg hurts. And if things get serious, there's always the temple of Aesculapius. Sick Romans often made pilgrimages to this healing sanctuary, bringing offerings, sleeping in the sacred halls, and hoping the god would send a dream diagnosis. Spoiler, the god rarely came with prescriptions. But dreams? Oh, they came in vivid waves, especially if you skipped dinner and drank the temple wine. For those not quite spiritual, there were still household remedies. Roman kitchens doubled as pharmacies. Every good Roman wife and many clever slaves knew at least 10 cures for a cough, 3 for diarrhea, and 1 for curses, just in case. Honey was a favorite. Smear it on wounds, mix it with vinegar for coughs, or just eat it when you're sad. Cabbage, a miracle plant. Good for digestion, poison antidote, hangover cure, and, if you believed Pliny, the moral backbone of the Republic. Speaking of hangovers, Roman medicine was often reactive. You didn't see a doctor because you felt off. You saw one because something had already gone spectacularly wrong. Knife wound? Let's cauterize it with hot iron. Toothache? Let's pull it gently if you're rich, and with a prayer if you're not. And then there were the plagues. Rome, crowded and not exactly hand sanitizer friendly, was regularly visited by disease. Smallpox, typhoid, malaria, they all passed through at some point, usually announced by rumors, rising funerals, and the sudden popularity of amulets. Lucius, of course, locked down his villa the moment word of illness reached the Senate. Dr. Antiochus burned herbs, read ominous scrolls, and advised Lucius to avoid the color black and anyone named Marcus for a while. Did it help? Probably not, but it gave Lucius something to brag about over dinner. Claudia Tertia, meanwhile, had a very different experience. If someone in the villa got sick, she was the one cleaning the linens, preparing the broths, and disposing of the leeches. Yes, leeches. Romans believed they could draw out bad humors. Claudia believed they were small horrors that squished when stepped on. If she ever fell ill, which in a world of long hours, poor nutrition, and 0 breaks was often, she didn't ask for help. She made her own medicine. A pinch of mint, a hot stone on the belly, a whispered prayer to her mother's gods, and a promise to keep moving. Illness didn't exempt you from work, it just made the work heavier. Now, Roman beliefs about the body were charming. They thought the brain's main function was to cool the blood, that women's wombs wandered inside their bodies and caused mood swings, that sneezing could expel evil spirits, and that left-handed twitching meant something ominous was on the way. To be fair, they weren't completely wrong about the last one. Lucius's cousin twitched once and tripped into a fountain. Despite the missteps, Rome was slowly advancing. There were surgeries, anatomy studies, even rudimentary prosthetics. Doctors kept records. Some experimented with anesthesia, alcohol, usually, and hospitals, military ones, mostly began to appear on the empire's fringes. But for most Romans, health was a matter of chance, tradition, and trying not to anger whatever minor god controlled sore throats. As night falls, Dr. Antiochus retires to his quarters, confident that Lucius's liver spots are probably not prophetic. Gaius rubs his shoulder, mutters something about old age, and warms another cloth. Claudia washes her hands in cold water, ties a rag around her head to ward off dizziness, and whispers one last hope to the ceiling beams. The empire sleeps. But the body never rests. It aches, it stumbles, it recovers, sometimes with help, sometimes in spite of it. So rest well, curious patient. Your pulse is strong, your dreams are vivid, and tomorrow, the gods willing, no one will offer you boiled cabbage for a headache. Probably. Tonight, we descend from gods and gladiators into a far darker corner of Roman life, crime and punishment. Not the elegant kind, with courtroom speeches and moral clarity. No, this is Rome. Think fewer lawyers, more chains, less innocent until proven guilty, more you look suspicious, start running. Let's set the scene. The Roman Empire was massive, chaotic, and impressively creative with both law and loopholes. There were laws for everything, how wide your cart's wheels could be, how much perfume you could import, and yes, even how many mourners were allowed to cry at your funeral. Too many? That's suspicious. But the real tension wasn't in the laws themselves, it was in who could afford to ignore them. Take Lucius Fabius, senator, rich, connected, and blessed with the kind of smile that says, I've never faced consequences. He could commit a minor fraud, say, pocketing funds meant for a new aqueduct, and the worst he'd get is a stern letter and a smaller statue in the forum. Maybe. Meanwhile, Gaius Domitianus, our potter, steals a loaf of bread during a grain shortage. He's in for a public flogging, or worse, a fine so steep he might as well offer up his houseplant collection in collateral. The Roman legal system was like a scale. Balanced, yes, but one side was always heavier with gold. And don't forget Claudia Tertia, a slave. Legally, she wasn't even a person, she was property. If she broke something, refused an order, or even spoke out of turn, the punishment wasn't due process, it was instant. Whipping, confinement, or being sold to a less forgiving household. And her word? Worth exactly 0 in court, unless a citizen decided to speak for her, which, spoiler, they usually didn't. Now, how did Rome keep all this in order? The urban cohort, a kind of ancient police force made up of former soldiers with more muscle than manners. They patrolled the streets, broke up fights, stopped fires, and occasionally showed up just late enough to let things get entertaining. Then there were the lictors, bodyguards for magistrates, carrying bundles of rods and axes called fasces. Yes, the same symbol later borrowed by some less charming governments. In Rome, fasces meant, I can arrest you, beat you, or chop something off. Please don't make me prove it. Trials did exist, especially for higher status crimes. Accusations were shouted in the forum. Evidence included witnesses, written records, and, occasionally, vibes. The rich hired orators, lawyers who doubled as performance artists. Cicero made a career out of defending, prosecuting, and dramatically weeping at the right moment. The poor, they hoped the magistrate was having a good day. Punishments ranged from fines to exile to execution. And oh, did Rome have options? Crucifixion for slaves and rebels, beheading for citizens, the nice version, burning, drowning, even being sewn into a sack with animals. Yes, really. It was called poena culae, and if you murdered your father, congratulations, you now share a bag with a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey. Why those animals? No one knows. Rome had a flair for symbolic chaos, but crime wasn't just about violence or theft. Moral offenses were a big deal too. Adultery, disrespecting your elders, wearing the wrong color at the wrong time. Rome monitored behavior like a nosy neighbor with a scroll, especially for women. A married woman caught cheating could be banished, divorced, or locked in her home with nothing but sad poetry and a moral lesson. Lucius, being a model citizen with discreet habits, attended public trials for entertainment. He'd lean in, nod wisely, and whisper judgments as if he weren't avoiding a corruption charge himself. Gaius avoided the courts entirely. He couldn't afford the time, the risk, or the toga rental. If someone stole from his stall, he'd shout, maybe chase them, and then curse them with language that would make Mercury wince. And Claudia? She saw everything. Rich guests bribing officials, servants arrested for things their masters did, an entire silver tray that disappeared, and was blamed on the kitchen boy who hadn't seen silver in weeks. She knew which punishments were fair, which were political, and which were just cruel. But she kept her head down. In Rome, justice was a performance, and she wasn't cast in the speaking roles. Still, there were moments of irony. A nobleman caught in a scandal, a governor tried for treason, a corrupt official finally exiled to a province he once mocked. Rome had its moral spasms. And when it punished the powerful, the people cheered, not because they loved justice, but because they loved a good downfall. At night, the city quieted, but fear lingered. Lanterns flickered in alleyways, dogs barked. Somewhere, a thief crept through shadows. Somewhere else, a drunk senator tried to remember where he left his sandals. And in the magistrate's house, scrolls of complaints piled up, some serious, some petty, all requiring judgment by someone who may or may not be awake. So sleep now, little citizen. Lock your door, hide your valuables, keep your stories straight. Rome is watching, and its laws, they might not catch you today, but they never forget a name, especially if it fits nicely on a plaque. Tonight, we leave behind the courts and colosseums and slip into something softer, something that Roman poets wrote sonnets about, something that senators tried and failed to regulate, and something that made every toga-wearing noble and sandal-clad laborer sigh at least once in their life: love and marriage in ancient Rome. Now, if you're expecting candlelit dinners, heartfelt vows, and long walks along the Tiber, congratulations, you've been watching the wrong empire. Roman romance was less slow dance under the stars and more contract negotiation with a side of mild affection. Let's start with Lucius Fabius and Julia Calpurnia, his wife of 18 years. Their marriage, like most among the elite, wasn't about passion. It was about property, politics, and producing sons who could quote Homer without blinking. When they married, it wasn't in a white dress or under flower arches. It was in a carefully curated ceremony involving fire, bread, and 7 witnesses who pretended not to notice the awkward silences. Lucius brought land, Julia brought a dowry, and together they brought the crushing weight of familial expectations. Love, optional. Respect, encouraged. Mutual financial benefit, required. But don't be too quick to judge. There were moments over dinner, during long walks through the atrium, or late at night when the city was quiet, where Lucius would touch her hand, or Julia would laugh at something he said, intentionally or not, and for a fleeting second, there was warmth. Not the fiery passion of a Greek tragedy, but something gentler. A partnership. Down the social ladder, things looked a bit different. Gaius Domitianus, our eternally stressed potter, married Livia, the widow of a fishmonger. Their courtship was simple: shared meals, mutual complaints about taxes, and the realization that splitting rent is easier than paying it solo. Their wedding took place in the back room of a tavern, officiated by a friend with a shaky memory of the legal words, and followed by a meal of bread, olives, and enough wine to make even Livia's skeptical cousin crack a smile. There were no grand toasts, but plenty of toasts, and that was enough. In Rome, marriage was mostly a civil contract. No priests, no divine mandates, just paperwork, witnesses, and a mutual understanding that life was easier with someone who could help churn butter and hold your place in the grain line. And if it didn't work out, divorce was surprisingly easy. Just declare it, return the dowry, and hope no one writes a rude poem about you. Ah yes, love poetry. Rome's true obsession. Poets like Catullus, Propertius, and Ovid turned unrequited love into high art. They pined, they praised, they wept, they occasionally stalked. Their lovers, often courtesans or fictionalized women, were mysterious, cruel, divine, or very, very unavailable, which, according to Roman tradition, made them even more attractive. These poets taught Rome that love wasn't about security. It was about longing. The more tortured, the better. If your heart didn't feel like it had been personally stepped on by Venus herself, were you even in love? Of course, not everyone had time for poetry. Claudia Tertia, for example, didn't get to choose love. As a slave, her relationships were limited, her body was not her own, and her future depended on the whims of people who debated whether she looked better in linen or wool. But even Claudia had secrets. A glance shared with the steward in the garden, a stolen moment behind the storeroom, nothing permanent, nothing spoken, but enough to keep hope alive. Because even in Rome, even under chains, the heart whispers. And sometimes, it whispers the name of someone who remembers your real laugh. Back in the upper echelons, Roman women like Julia Calpurnia had their own power. While public life was for men, the private realm, marriage, children, household diplomacy, was where women thrived. A sharp wife could guide a husband's career with well-placed flattery or a timely roll of the eyes. And don't be fooled. Behind every successful Roman politician was a wife who knew exactly who not to invite to dinner. And then there were the extramarital affairs. Rome, for all its laws and lectures, was wonderfully hypocritical. Men could take lovers, visit courtesans, and write passionate scrolls about barmaids they met once in Gaul. Women, not so much. Adultery laws for women were strict. Caught in the act, a woman could be divorced, disowned, even exiled. The double standard was thicker than a senator's neck. Still, some women found ways to reclaim romance. They wrote letters, carved graffiti, or simply chose celibacy and gossip instead of marriage and disappointment. Love in Rome was never fair, but it was always creative. And let's not forget the festivals. Lupercalia, for example, a wild celebration where young men ran through the streets slapping people with goatskin thongs for fertility. Nothing says romance like light assault and the faint scent of livestock. By the end of the day, Rome was full of every kind of relationship. Strategic marriages, messy affairs, lifelong partnerships, one-night regrets, and hopeful flirtations. The empire didn't care if your heart was full, it cared if your taxes were paid. But the people? They cared deeply. They loved with the same intensity they worshipped, fought, and gossiped with full volume and very little restraint. So sleep now, little romantic. Dream of figs and whispered vows, of moonlit courtyards and secret letters. Love in Rome was never easy, but it was unforgettable. Tonight, we leave behind stolen glances and goatskin flirtations and head straight for something even more complex, less poetic, and arguably more dangerous than Rome: education and childhood. Because while Rome may have birthed emperors, engineers, and at least 3 guys named Brutus who didn't turn out great, none of them got there without years of wax tablets, strict tutors, and emotional damage. Let's begin with young Quintus Fabius, son of our ever-prestigious Senator Lucius Fabius and Julia Calpurnia. He's 9 years old, knows how to decline Latin verbs faster than you can blink, and already carries the weight of at least 7 ancestors' legacies on his tiny shoulders. Quintus doesn't have toys. He has expectations. His day begins with a brisk wash in cold water, because apparently comfort breeds weakness, followed by a meager breakfast and a long session with his tutor, Marcus Crassus, a man who hasn't smiled since the reign of Tiberius. Marcus teaches reading, writing, rhetoric, and the fine art of not blinking while being insulted in Greek. Discipline is key. Make a mistake and you get the rod, a gentle euphemism for being smacked with a stick until you remember how to spell Cicero. And forget about recess. The only thing Roman children ran toward was adulthood, and even that was mostly a trap. Now, not all Roman kids got this high-end abuse. Gaius Domitianus' 2 nephews, for instance, go to a ludus, a basic school where they learn the alphabet, basic math, and how to dodge the teacher's sandals. The room smells like sweat and ink. The teacher is paid in coins and occasionally cheese. Lessons are loud, chaotic, and frequently interrupted by street vendors outside yelling about hot lentils. Girls? Here's where things get murky. If you were lucky, rich, and had parents who read Greek tragedy without sighing too loudly, you got a private tutor, usually teaching you how to read, manage a household, and survive a dinner party without embarrassing the family. If you weren't lucky, you learned by watching. You learned from your mother, from older sisters, from gossip and prayer rituals. You learned that silence was a virtue, but memorizing the spice rack might save your marriage one day. Not exactly Plato, but it got the job done. Claudia Tertia, at age 22, remembers her education clearly. Her village had no school, but her grandmother taught her herbal lore, weather signs, and a long list of Roman names to avoid. When she was sold into Lucius's household, she learned faster than any elite child because mistakes didn't cost grades. They cost everything else. But Rome didn't just educate children. It produced citizens. Every lesson was a building block toward becoming a proper Roman. Loyal, articulate, slightly condescending, and deeply committed to wearing the correct number of stripes on your toga. Advanced education was only for the few. If Quintus proved worthy, he'd go on to study with a grammaticus, then maybe a rhetor, then off to Athens or Alexandria to really soak in that elite snobbery. He'd return quoting Aristotle, criticizing local art, and pretending to forget how his hometown smells in summer. But most kids didn't make it that far. They became apprentices, farmers, shopkeepers. They learned trade skills, family crafts, or how to smile while being shortchanged at market. Rome needed scholars, but it needed workers more. And then there was play. Yes, Roman children played with wax balls, spinning tops dice, dolls made of clay or rags. They made up games with rules no one wrote down, wrestled in courtyards, and occasionally annoyed the family goat until it fought back. But every game, every shout, every scraped knee happened under the looming shadow of adulthood. Childhood was short, sweet, and usually interrupted by a chore. Religion snuck into their days too. Little Quintus offered prayers to his lares, household gods who were basically divine babysitters. Festivals gave him days off. Saturnalia let him boss around adults for a bit. But mostly, childhood was preparation. A Roman child wasn't seen as a miniature person. They were an investment, and when tragedy struck, and it often did, mourning was brief, polite, and rarely public. Children died young. Disease, accidents, bad water, worse doctors. You loved them, yes, but you didn't name them too early. Superstition warned against that. And if they made it to 10, then you could exhale. Still, there were moments. Julia Calpurnia holding her son's hand as he read his first full scroll. Gaius ruffling his nephew's hair after a day's work at the pottery wheel. Claudia slipping an extra honey cake to a child who reminded her of home. In a city obsessed with power, children reminded everyone that there was still softness underneath the stone. So tonight, as Rome settles down, children all across the city dream of lions, gods, and not having to recite poetry tomorrow. Tutors lay down their rods. Parents breathe the strange mix of exhaustion and pride, and somewhere a boy named Quintus whispers Latin into the dark, hoping tomorrow he gets it right. Sleep well, little student, your empire is waiting. And your homework? Eternal. Tonight, we walk away from the scribbled wax tablets and whispered bedtime Latin to explore a more elusive realm of Roman life, leisure and entertainment. Because believe it or not, when Romans weren't building empires debating philosophy or inventing increasingly passive-aggressive laws, they actually knew how to have a good time. Sort of. Let's begin where every Roman hopes to end up on a hot afternoon, the public baths. Ah yes, the great equalizer. Rich or poor, citizen or freedman, as long as you had a few coins and could pretend not to stare, you were welcome. Lucius Fabius, our high-tier toga enthusiast, visits the grandest thermae in town. Columns, mosaics, steam rising like drama in the Senate. Lucius enters with his entourage, a slave carrying his oils, another holding towels, and a third whose entire job is to stand nearby and look judgmental. Inside, it's a whole circuit. Warm room, tepidarium, hot room, caldarium, plunge into the cold pool, frigidarium, followed by a scraping session with a strigil, basically a metal spatula for peeling off the regrets of the day. But this isn't just about getting clean, it's networking. You soak, you sweat, you chat about trade routes, scandalous neighbors, or the latest scandalous trade route. Some come for gossip, others for the massage, and a few simply to eavesdrop and make mental notes for blackmail opportunities. Meanwhile, Gaius Domitianus hits a much smaller, much louder bathhouse. Less marble, more mildew. Still, it's his favorite spot. He knows the regulars. There's the fish seller who sings off-key, the baker who always brings extra bread, and the guy who insists the water is too cold no matter what. Here, the baths are a place to rest sore muscles, forget overdue taxes, and pretend, just for an hour, that the world isn't out to collect. And let's not forget Claudia Tertia, who, of course, doesn't bathe in public. As a slave, she bathes quickly, discreetly, and only when permitted. But sometimes when everyone's gone to market and the house is quiet, she fills a basin with rainwater, adds a sprig of lavender she wasn't supposed to take, and breathes. For 5 whole minutes, she exists just for herself. In Rome, that's practically a vacation. But bathing wasn't the only fun on the menu. Romans loved games. Board games like Ludus Latrunculorum, which was basically ancient chess with more shouting. Dice games were popular too, especially among soldiers, gamblers, and people who enjoyed explaining to their spouse why the rent was late again. Children played with hoops, balls, and miniature chariots made of sticks and wishful thinking. Adults watched races in the Circus Maximus, the largest arena in Rome, where charioteers risked life and limb for fame, fortune, and the occasional autograph from a tipsy senator. The races were intense. Teams had colors, red, white, blue, green, and fans took sides with football-level devotion. Fights broke out. Bets were made. People lost everything, cheering for a man in a leather helmet yelling at horses. And when crashes happened, which they often did, the crowd roared like it was a divine sign, which, to be fair, it might have been. Then there were theaters. Plays ranged from high tragedy, where noble Romans in masks cried about fate and betrayal, to slapstick comedies with fart jokes, mistaken identities, and at least one guy falling into a fountain. Think Shakespeare meets a really loud street performer. Lucius preferred the tragedies. Gaius laughed hardest at the guy in the chicken costume. Food? A major leisure activity. Dinner parties were their own form of theater. Lucius threw elaborate convivia with 9-course meals, live music, and guests arranged by status so carefully it could qualify as art. There were oysters, dormice dipped in honey, flamingo tongues, yes, really, and wine watered down to avoid scandal. No one drank it straight, unless they were barbarian or 22 and trying to be impressive. Julia Calpurnia presided over these events with grace, making sure conversation flowed and no one choked on a peacock feather. Topics included politics, poetry, and whether that new governor in Gaul was sleeping with his sister. The answer, as always, was probably. For those less flush with coin, meals were simpler but still joyful. Gaius and Livia shared lentils, cheese, olives, and maybe a treat from the market if the day was kind. Their table was small, the chairs creaked, and the wine was strong, but the laughter was real. And then came festivals. Rome had dozens. Saturnalia was a fan favorite. Social roles reversed, slaves dined with masters, gifts were exchanged, and for a few glorious days, chaos was the law. Think Roman Christmas, but with more wine and fewer sweaters. Other festivals honored gods with games, sacrifices, parades, and public holidays that mostly involved standing around and pretending the omens looked favorable. Claudia loved these days, not for the rituals, but for the brief break in routine. Sometimes she'd stand in a crowd watching dancers or listening to flutes and feel, for a moment, almost free. Even death had its leisure. Funeral games, wakes with stories and songs, tombs inscribed with jokes or warnings like "Don't steal my bones." Romans faced mortality with wine in one hand and a knowing smirk in the other. So tonight, as the city quiets, the amphorae are drained, the bathhouses emptied, and the dice games settled, poorly, Rome dreams of its pleasures, of laughter echoing in tiled halls, of wine spilled in good company, of sandals kicked off after a long day, toes wiggling against cool stone. Rest now, little reveler. The gods may not party, but the Romans certainly did. And tomorrow, if you're lucky, you just might get an invite. Tonight, we drift from the warm laughter of dinner parties into something colder, quieter, and far more eternal: death and the afterlife in ancient Rome. Because no matter how powerful, clever, or dramatically well-dressed you were, Rome had one rule for everyone: someday, you die. And when you do, the paperwork is surprisingly intense. Let's begin, naturally, with a death. In the villa of Lucius Fabius, a relative has passed. Not a close one. Thankfully, just a second cousin with a name no one can spell and a fondness for playing the lyre badly at family dinners. Still, death requires ritual, and in Rome, ritual is never optional. The body is washed by the women of the household, Julia Calpurnia among them. It's a solemn task done with oils and silence, even if the deceased once tried to flirt with a senator's wife after 2 sips of watered wine. The eyes are closed, coins placed over them to pay Charon, the mythical ferryman of the underworld, who, like most Roman service workers, never accepts credit. Then comes the procession, a public affair, because what's the point of dying if people don't watch? Professional mourners, Yes, hired, wail dramatically, tearing their tunics and throwing themselves around with the enthusiasm of someone who just realized they're not in the will. Musicians play haunting tunes. The corpse is paraded through the streets in a wax death mask, eerily lifelike and slightly smug. At the forum, a eulogy is delivered. Lucius naturally steps forward. He speaks of family honor, noble service, and how the dearly departed once defeated a very aggressive goose during Saturnalia. The crowd nods. The goose story always lands. But what happens next depends on your status. For the elite, cremation is common. The body is burned on a pyre, the ashes collected in an urn and placed in a columbarium, a communal tomb with little niches that's like a post office for the dead. For the poor, burial is more common. Simpler, cheaper, and with fewer chances of being accidentally roasted with someone else's uncle. And for slaves, well, if their master was kind, they might be buried. If not, the Tiber takes what it's given. Claudia Tertia has seen many of these rituals. She's carried urns, swept ashes, and watched names carved into stone by men who spelled virtue 3 different ways. But her thoughts on death are private. She doesn't fear it exactly. In Rome, death is just the next obligation. Romans weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of being forgotten, which is why tombs were often elaborate, especially for those who could afford them. Inscriptions boasted of titles, victories, or deeply passive-aggressive messages like, "I lived well, don't touch my stuff." Some included poems. Others had carvings of banquet scenes, as if to say, "I died, but the party continues." Even freedmen, like Publius Severus, the scroll scribe, scrimped for tombs. His will includes money set aside for a modest stone, a short inscription, and a small sculpture of himself holding a scroll, looking both wise and slightly annoyed. Legacy matters. More than comfort, more than truth. And what of the afterlife? Romans had a beautifully vague relationship with it. The underworld, Hades, later Pluto's realm, was dark, vast, and full of moral complications. Good people might rest in the Elysian fields, a paradise of endless sunlight and philosophical debates. The wicked? They ended up in Tartarus, where eternal punishment waited in imaginative, slightly theatrical forms. But most souls, average, imperfect, unremarkable, just drifted in the fields of asphodel. Not tortured, not rewarded, just existing, like waiting in a very long line at the bakery, but forever. Still, to avoid haunting the living, the dead required respect. Parentalia, a 9-day festival in February, honored ancestors with food, flowers, and whispered prayers. Families visited tombs, cleaned them, and left offerings: bread, wine, maybe a coin. Forget to do it, and you might wake up to cold air, bad dreams, and the subtle suggestion that grandpa is annoyed. Superstition clung to death like ivy. Certain days were dies nefasti, unlucky, sacred, or both, when no legal action or business could take place. Funerals were avoided on these days, as were weddings, lawsuits, and major life choices like starting a new amphora shop. And ghosts? Absolutely real, according to everyone from priests to pub-goers. They weren't necessarily evil, just confused, unfinished, or really annoyed you didn't finish that prayer. Nighttime in Rome was filled with quiet fears. Doors closed early, lamps were kept lit. Some people whispered charms before bed, just in case. Gaius Domitianus, ever the realist, kept a small shrine in his home with a crude carving of Mercury. Not because he feared death, but because he wanted someone to watch his back if he dropped dead in the middle of throwing clay. He told his nephews that if he did die, they should bury him upright so I can still see who owes me money. And Claudia, she dreams of being remembered, not with statues or scrolls, but with kindness. A soft word, a shared joke, a moment when someone says, "She was here, she mattered, she mattered." Because in Rome, immortality wasn't in the stars, it was in the stories. The names on stones, the offerings on cold mornings, the echo of laughter that outlives its speaker. So tonight, as the torches flicker and the city exhales, think of those who walked before, of urns tucked in quiet tombs, of coins left for Charon, of names carved by hands long gone. Sleep gently, little traveler. The road ahead is long. But if Rome has taught us anything, it's this: you don't have to live forever, just long enough to be remembered. Tonight, we rise from the tombstones and step into something just as intimidating, only better dressed. Power and politics in ancient Rome. And trust me, it wasn't just marble buildings and noble speeches. It was a blood sport in sandals. Less public service, more who can stab whom the most poetically. Our guide, as always, is Lucius Fabius, whose senatorial robe is starched to perfection and whose ambition could power an aqueduct. By day, he walks the halls of the Curia, the Senate House, with the practiced frown of someone who disapproves of everything newer than Jupiter. By night, he writes letters, flatters allies, and quietly bribes anyone who looks underpaid and overinformed. Politics in Rome was everywhere, literally, from graffiti on walls to whispered deals in bathhouses. And power, it wasn't just about having it, it was about showing it. Lucius wears his ring with his family crest, say his slaves call out his name in the forum, and his house is so symmetrical it hurts to look at. But let's rewind, because political power in Rome came in stages. First, you had to be male, free, rich, and preferably related to someone who already had a bust in the atrium. If you checked those boxes, you could begin the cursus honorum, the Roman political career ladder. Think of it as the ancient version of LinkedIn, but with more assassination. You start as quaestor, basically an accountant who hopes no one audits too hard. Then aedile, where you organize festivals, fix streets, and try not to run out of garum during Saturnalia. After that, praetor, judge, jury, and occasional party host. And finally, if Fortuna smiles or your rivals suffer mysterious boating accidents, you become consul, the highest elected office. Lucius, he's made it to praetor and dreams of more. His speeches are filled with flowery metaphors, dramatic pauses, and just enough ancient virtue to make you forget he once embezzled a shipment of marble. His rivals nod politely while sharpening metaphorical daggers behind scrolls. But politics wasn't limited to Rome's elite. Oh no. Gaius Domitianus, down in the insulae, feels it too. When the grain supply falters, when taxes rise, when a new governor decides pottery tariffs are the hill he wants to die on, Gaius suffers. He curses senators with creative vocabulary and swears he'll vote differently if elections were ever actually about choice. And let's not forget Claudia Tertia. She doesn't vote. She doesn't speak at forums, but she hears everything. Which guest arrived with bribes hidden in fruit baskets? Which senator's son keeps disappearing into the storerooms with the flute player? Claudia collects secrets like others collect denarii, quietly, carefully, because in Rome, information is a weapon, and even the unarmed can learn to aim. Of course, there's another level to Roman power, the emperor. By now, Rome has slid from republic to empire like a togaed soap opera. The Senate still exists, but it mostly applauds and hopes the emperor doesn't notice anyone blinking too loudly. The emperor holds imperium, absolute authority. He commands the army, controls the treasury, appoints officials, and looks great on coins. But he also lives in fear of poison, of rebellion, of someone naming their dog Little Caesar as a political statement. Some emperors are wise, some are terrifying, a few are both. And every senator, Lucius included, walks the razor's edge between loyalty and survival. One wrong speech, one misread omen, and you're exiled to a goat farm in Thrace. Behind the scenes, power brokers, wives, freedmen, fortune tellers, even slaves who whisper the wrong thing at the right time. Rome isn't just built by armies, it's run by shadows. And yet, for all its danger, Roman politics had one irresistible feature: glory. To stand in the forum, to hear your name cheered, to inscribe your victories in stone, this was the Roman dream, even if your enemies cheered louder the moment you tripped on your own ambition. Lucius understands this. Every decision, every alliance, every calculated silence, it's all part of the dance. And he dances well, too well. His name is rising, his opponents are nervous, and somewhere in a smoky side room of a temple, someone lights a candle and wonders what Lucius would look like in a tomb sculpture. But the people remember, not just the powerful, but those swept up in their wake. Gaius, who once fixed a senator's pot and got paid in compliments. Claudia, who saw a bribe exchanged during a birthday toast. Julia Calpurnia, who rewrote her husband's speech while he slept. Rome watches, Rome remembers, and Rome rewards, if only briefly. So sleep now, little schemer. The Senate awaits, the dice are always rolling, and somewhere under the full moon, someone's plotting a campaign with honeyed words and sharpened smiles. Just another night in the Republic, or what's left of it. Tonight, we unroll the scroll of empire and step beyond Rome's marble streets into the vast, unpredictable, and occasionally revolting world of Roman provinces. Because yes, Rome wasn't just Rome, it was an empire, a stitched-together quilt of cultures, climates, and complaints, held together by roads, legions, and sheer bureaucratic stamina. At the center of this imperial web is, of course, our resident senator, Lucius Fabius, who's just been assigned oversight of the province of Baetica, modern-day southern Spain. On paper, this is an honor. In reality, it's a logistical nightmare sprinkled with olive oil. Baetica is rich in resources, wine, oil, minerals, and people who deeply resent Roman taxes. Lucius reads the first dispatch with a polite frown and a growing suspicion that governor is Latin for blame sponge. He must collect revenue, maintain order, and pretend not to notice that the local magistrate's cousin keeps disappearing shipments of grain. But it's not all bad. There's a villa with a view, provincial wine that tastes like ambition, and locals eager to flatter him in broken Latin. Lucius smiles, nods, and promises roads. Roads are always a safe topic. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Gaius Domitianus wonders how his cousin's pottery shop in Gaul is doing. Letters from the provinces take weeks, if they arrive at all. When they do, they're often smudged, vague, and filled with questionable spelling. Still, they bring news of strange foods, colder weather, and Romans trying very hard to stay Roman while living among people who think togas are weird. And Claudia Tertia? She listens. One of the new kitchen boys is from Britannia, a province so far north it might as well be myth. He speaks little Latin, smells of seaweed, and claims his grandmother fought a Roman with a broom. Claudia believes him. Rome may have conquered the world, but the world did not always agree. Let's be clear, Rome's provinces were not all the same. Egypt was ancient and wealthy, its temples older than Rome's gods. Judea was tense, spiritual, and deeply resistant to Roman control. Gaul was wild, with forests full of druids, boars, and villagers suspiciously good at ambushes. Some provinces embraced Roman rule. They built forums, adopted Latin, and tried out Roman hairstyles with varying success. Others tolerated it with taxes, tributes, and quiet eye rolls. And some, they revolted, loudly, repeatedly, with swords. The empire responded with roads and forts and legions stationed like ominous house guests. Everywhere Rome went, it left its footprint: aqueducts, temples, amphitheaters, and also bureaucracy. The provinces were crawling with officials, procurators, legatees, tax collectors. If you sneezed in Lusitania, someone in the Senate got a scroll about it. But governance wasn't just about control, it was about performance. Lucius hosts a feast for local leaders. He wears his nicest toga, pronounces local names with exaggerated care, and offers gifts imported from the capital: olive oil, perfume, and a silver spoon no one will use. The locals smile, bow, and gift him a large roasted animal of uncertain origin. It's diplomacy, it's theater, it's survival. For Rome, the provinces were both pride and burden. They fueled the economy, expanded the glory, and made emperors look taller. But they also required constant maintenance. Roads washed out, bandits multiplied, governors skimmed off the top, and every now and then, someone named Arminius reminded Rome that not everyone liked sharing temples. Yet despite it all, Roman culture spread. Latin inscriptions popped up on temples in Syria. Roman coins changed hands in Numidia. In the markets of Antioch, you could buy figs, silk, and a cheap statue of Augustus with suspiciously small feet. And the people changed too. A merchant in Cappadocia might dress like a Roman, worship local gods, and swear in 3 languages, depending on the price of fish. The empire was messy. Glorious, but messy, like a feast with too many sauces. Claudia hears stories of provinces from travelers and servants. A singer from Alexandria who insists the sunsets there are liquid gold. A soldier from Dacia who misses snow and his mother's curse words. They speak of homes far from Rome, but shaped by it, loved, resented, remembered. Even Gaius in his tiny workshop dreams sometimes of the provinces, not for glory, but for escape. A quieter place, a slower life, maybe fewer taxes, maybe not. Still, he imagines it. And Lucius? He returns to Rome after his term ends, older, warier, and with a slight accent he pretends not to hear. He files reports, makes speeches, and tries to convince everyone that Baetica is stable, profitable, and deeply grateful. Which is technically true if you don't ask too many questions. So tonight, as the empire slumbers, ships creak in distant harbors, governors review grain counts by lamplight, and villagers somewhere chant in a language Rome will never learn. The provinces breathe. They bend, stretch, mutter in local dialects, and carry the weight of an empire pretending it still fits. Rest now, little centurion of the mind. The borders may be far, but they are part of you. And in Rome, every map is also a mirror. Tonight, we step out of the governor's villa, past the frontier forts and provincial gossip, and dive into the absolute chaos, miracle, and bureaucratic nightmare that was the Roman military. Because if Rome was an empire built on ambition, it was held together by sandals, swords, and soldiers who knew at least 5 different ways to yell in Latin. Our guide into this sweaty, shield-heavy world is Marcus Varro, a distant cousin of Lucius Fabius, and the sort of man who joined the legion because he liked walking long distances in full armor while being yelled at. At 25, he has calloused hands, 2 missing teeth, and a deeply committed relationship with his javelin. Let's start with recruitment. You didn't just walk up and say, "Sign me up." No, you got measured, inspected, interrogated, and occasionally poked in places that had nothing to do with swordsmanship. Only the fit, healthy, and not too ugly were allowed in. Rome had standards, even for cannon fodder. Once in, life became routine. Wake up, drill, march, drill more, clean your gear, curse the centurion, then march some more. Soldiers carried everything they owned, armor, weapons, food, cookware, and whatever dignity they had left on their backs. They were called Marius's mules, and if you didn't cry during your first 30-mile hike, you weren't doing it right. And the armor, it looked cool, felt like regret. A cuirass made of iron strips, greaves, a rectangular shield the size of a small door, a helmet with cheek guards that made it nearly impossible to hear insults properly. But it worked. Roman soldiers weren't pretty, they were terrifying. Now, discipline in the army was creative. You fall asleep on guard duty, prepare to be stoned to death by your fellow soldiers. Literally. It was called fustuarium, and yes, it was a team-building exercise. Desertion, theft, insubordination, all got punished in ways that made civilian trials look like poetry readings. But for all the fear, the Roman military was a machine. Efficient, brutal, and smart. They built roads, forts, bridges, and siege engines faster than you could say barbarian uprising. The testudo formation? Genius. Shields locked tight overhead, front and sides, basically a moving tank made of grunts and sweat. And let's not forget the legions themselves, each with its number, symbol, usually an animal that could rip your face off, and a fan base that rivaled chariot racing teams. Marcus belonged to Legio IX Hispana, known for its discipline, valor, and tendency to mysteriously vanish from historical records. But don't tell Marcus that, he still sends letters home. Speaking of home, Lucius Fabius, as a senator, has never held a sword that wasn't ceremonial, but he knows the value of the army. He votes on troop deployments, funds the legions badly, and gives passionate speeches about Roman honor while sipping wine from a glass someone else polished. Gaius Domitianus, meanwhile, sees the army differently. His brother served in Germania and came back with a limp, 1,000-yard stare, and stories involving frozen rivers and very angry locals. Gaius respects the legions. He also hides when recruiters come to town. And Claudia Tertia? She watches from the villa courtyard as retired soldiers pass through Rome, decorated in faded tunics and worn sandals. Some boast, some beg, some just walk like they've seen too much. Claudia knows the empire runs on their footsteps, but it rarely remembers their names. But the army wasn't just Roman-born men. By the late empire, many soldiers were provincials, freedmen, even barbarians promised citizenship after service. The auxilia, non-citizen troops, fought just as hard, often better, and got half the glory. It was Rome's unspoken rule. If you bleed enough, you might earn a toga. And when Rome expanded, it didn't just send soldiers, it sent culture, roads, and taxes, but always behind the shield wall. Legionaries built camps that became towns. They introduced local populations to Roman customs, wine, and the joy of debating plumbing techniques. The military camp was a marvel of order, gridded streets, designated latrines, a forum, a shrine, a bakery, because nothing says imperial dominance like carbs. Soldiers weren't just warriors. They were masons, engineers, part-time poets, bad ones, and full-time cynics. And when war came, oh, it came loudly. Trumpets, drums, spears, arrows, the charge of thousands of sandaled feet, organized chaos under eagle standards. Marcus remembered his first battle clearly, the shouting, the stink, the silence afterward. He doesn't talk about it much, but at night he still sleeps with his hand on his sword hilt. Victory brought spoils, coins, slaves, land grants. If you survived 25 years, you got a pension and a plot of land, hopefully not one infested with snakes. Retired soldiers became farmers, shopkeepers, or very grumpy neighbors who insisted everyone salute their chickens. But defeat was unthinkable, until it wasn't. Rome lost battles, lost men, lost provinces, and every time it did, the Senate debated. The generals blamed each other, and soldiers like Marcus buried their friends and kept marching. So sleep now, little legionary of the mind. The road is long, the campfires flicker, and somewhere beyond the horizon a trumpet sounds. Another day, another march, another empire held together by sandals and grit. Tonight, we loosen our sword belts and sharpen something else entirely, our curiosity. Because if there's one thing Rome built besides roads and resentments, it was knowledge. Yes, tonight, we enter the quiet yet deeply judgmental halls of Roman science, medicine, and philosophy, where ideas flourished, bodies suffered, and everyone had an opinion on the stars. Let's begin with Seneca Minor, philosopher, dramatist, and part-time political casualty. His works are quoted across the empire by men like Lucius Fabius, who keeps a copy of Letters to Lucilius in his study, mostly unopened but very well dusted. Lucius considers himself a student of wisdom, which in his case means occasionally sighing and saying, virtue is its own reward before raising taxes. Rome was obsessed with Greek thought, and let's be honest, they borrowed shamelessly. Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Rome imported their ideas like fine wine. They translated, annotated, and then argued about it loudly over dinner. Stoicism was especially trendy among senators. Control your emotions, accept fate, and act with reason. Which is ironic, considering most Senate meetings ended in shouting and passive-aggressive hand gestures. But philosophy wasn't just for the elite. Gaius Domitianus once listened to a traveling philosopher in the market square who declared that nothing is real. Gaius promptly dropped his basket of figs on the man's foot and said, "That felt pretty real." End of debate. Claudia Tertia, of course, had her own philosophy. Survive, adapt, stay invisible until you don't have to. No scrolls, no fancy terms, just wisdom carved out of necessity and stolen moments of peace. Now science, or what passed for it, was a curious mix of brilliance and bewilderment. The Romans were masters of engineering: aqueducts, roads, domes. They built things we still marvel at, often using math so accurate you'd swear a calculator was hiding in the forum. But when it came to medicine, things got creative. Enter Galen, the superstar physician whose medical theories dominated for over a millennium. He believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A proper balance meant health. An imbalance meant leeches. Always leeches. Have a headache? Must be too much blood. Let's drain some. Trouble sleeping? Cabbage and crushed mouse. Got a fever? Congratulations. We're going to bleed you and whisper to Mercury just in case. Lucius once had a bout of indigestion. His physician recommended boiled artichokes, fasting, and bathing in goat's milk. He did none of these and felt better in 3 days. For the poor, like Gaius, the doctor was often an old neighbor with a knife and strong opinions. Toothache? Yanked out with tongs. Wound? Slap on some vinegar and hope the gods are in a good mood. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the patient became a very quiet statue. Women had their own healers. Midwives, herbalists, and women who knew which root made you sleep and which one made your mother-in-law faint. Claudia once watched a local healer cure a fever with poppy syrup and whispered prayers. It was both effective and terrifying. And then there was astrology. Romans loved it. The stars weren't just twinkly lights, they were spreadsheets for your destiny. Your birth date determined your future, your lucky days, your marriage prospects, even your bowel movements if you read far enough. Lucius consulted astrologers before major decisions. So did emperors. One predicted Claudius would reign long and wisely. He lasted 13 years and died from mushrooms. So, half credit? Science and superstition danced together. People wore amulets, drew protective symbols, and avoided the number 13 before it was even cool. They feared eclipses, worshipped healing springs, and believed in dream omens with the same fervor they reserved for gladiator stats. But not everything was fear and guesswork. Roman surveyors could map a city with terrifying accuracy. Engineers designed cranes, pulleys, and even water-powered mills. Architects calculated weight loads before pouring a single pebble. And in places like Alexandria, knowledge bloomed like mold in a bathhouse. The real triumph of Roman knowledge wasn't always in innovation, it was in application. They took what the Greeks theorized and made it practical. They didn't just imagine flying machines, they built aqueducts that actually worked. And then slowly that knowledge spread through scrolls, schools, soldiers, and gossip. A boy in Gaul could learn geometry. A girl in Egypt could recite medicinal plants. A slave in Rome might memorize every construction trick just by watching carefully enough. So tonight, as the torches dim and the scrolls are rolled up, imagine the empire thinking, quietly, boldly, wrongly, often, but always thinking. Rest now, little philosopher. Whether your humors are balanced or your stars are misaligned, know this: in Rome, knowledge was never wasted. It was simply waiting for someone smart enough, desperate enough, or unlucky enough to use it. Tonight, we close the scrolls of philosophy and tuck away the smelling salts of Roman medicine to indulge in something Rome held even dearer than conquest, concrete, or the Senate's collective ego: religion and superstition. Because for all their temples, rituals, and gods with way too many arms, Romans were essentially just like us, afraid of what might happen if they forgot to knock on wood. Let's begin with the basics. Rome was polytheistic, meaning they had more gods than the average Roman had socks. There was a deity for everything: war, love, doors, boundaries, crossroads, wine, the sewer system. Yes, the Cloacina was literally the goddess of the sewer. Romans took sanitation seriously. At the top of the divine leaderboard were the Capitoline triad: Jupiter, king of the gods, thunder enthusiast, father of 42% of divine drama; Juno, his wife, patron of marriage and professional eye roller; and Minerva, goddess of wisdom, war strategy, and academic burnout. Their temple sat proudly atop the Capitoline Hill, which was basically the VIP lounge of Roman religion. Lucius Fabius, ever the proper senator, attends rituals like their mandatory office meetings. He makes offerings, lights incense, and pretends to understand augury, the ancient art of interpreting bird flight patterns as political advice. A seagull flew left? The tax reform must proceed. Religious life in Rome wasn't personal, it was civic. Gods were part of the state. If crops failed, it was because someone skipped a sacrifice. If the Tiber flooded, clearly a priest sneezed during a ritual. Religion was state security, public performance, and a handy excuse for every bad harvest. Rituals had to be perfect: every word, every gesture, every goat bleat. Mess up? Start over. The gods were picky. You didn't pray from the heart. You prayed from the script with backup goats, just in case. Gaius Domitianus didn't frequent temples much, too busy working. But like most Romans, he had a shrine to the lares, household gods that protected the home. Every morning, he muttered a half-asleep blessing while passing them, hoping they'd keep the bakery fire from spreading again. And Claudia Tertia? She believed in the penates, spirits of the pantry. She left offerings of bread crusts and whispered thanks when the olive oil lasted longer than expected. Her gods were quiet, domestic, and far less dramatic than Jupiter, who frankly needed a hobby besides thunderbolts and affairs. But Rome didn't just worship. It absorbed. When they conquered a new land, they often adopted the local gods, gave them Latin names, and slid them into the Roman pantheon like awkward dinner guests. Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Anatolia, all were welcomed, worshipped, and occasionally blamed for earthquakes. And then came emperor worship. Augustus, ever the PR genius, began the trend. "I'm not a god," he said, while quietly allowing people to build temples in his honor. Over time, dead emperors were deified, and living ones strongly suggested it. Temples to divine emperors popped up everywhere. Citizens burned incense to statues of men who once got food stuck in their togas. Lucius, ever politically aware, never missed a ritual for the divine Augustus. Not because he believed, but because he had seen what happened to people who didn't attend. Spoiler: exile, or worse, no invitations to the good banquets. But belief wasn't enough. Rome was soaked in superstition. Amulets, charms, curses. Yes, even elite Romans carried good luck tokens shaped like phalluses. Don't judge. The gods worked in mysterious, slightly inappropriate ways. If someone sneezed, you said salve, not out of politeness, but to ward off evil. If your left foot itched, you were going on a trip. If a black dog barked at you at midnight, start writing your will, fast. Curses were a whole industry. People wrote their grievances on thin sheets of lead called defixions and buried them in graves or tossed them into wells. I curse the chariot driver Marcus, may his wheels splinter and his sandals chafe. Harsh, but oddly specific. Temples were everywhere. Not just grand ones, but small street shrines, roadside altars, and hidden cult spaces. Rome was noisy with prayer, smoky with incense, and always just one lightning strike away from panic. And then there were the mystery cults, secretive, foreign, often frowned upon. Cults of Mithras, Isis, and Dionysus promised personal salvation, emotional catharsis, and the occasional ritual involving a bull and questionable choreography. These cults spread among soldiers, slaves, women, anyone looking for something deeper than public sacrifice and political theater. Claudia once witnessed a ceremony to Isis. Candles flickered, chants echoed, the air felt thick, like something ancient and patient was listening. She didn't speak of it, but she never forgot it. Even natural disasters had religious explanations. Earthquakes, the gods were angry. Plague, the gods were furious. A bird pooping on your toga, divine judgment. You couldn't swing a sacrificial chicken without hitting an omen. And yet, amid all this fear and ritual, there was something strangely beautiful. Festivals like Lupercalia, Saturnalia, and Parentalia brought people together. They danced, laughed, remembered the dead, and felt, however briefly, that they were part of something cosmic. So tonight, as Rome's temples fall silent and the stars blink above the Tiber, remember this. The gods watched. The spirits listened. And somewhere, under marble columns and flickering oil lamps, someone whispered a prayer. Not out of fear, but out of hope. Rest now, little augur of the night. May your dreams be free of bad omens and your left foot never itch at dawn. Tonight, we step out of the shadows of temples and into the glittering, whisper-filled world of Roman social classes. Because in Rome, who you were wasn't just about what you did. It was about where you sat, how your toga was folded, and whether anyone pretended to care when you sneezed. Let's begin at the top, naturally, with our friend Lucius Fabius. As a senator, he's in the 1% of the 1%. Though he would never say that out loud, he'd simply wear it in his posture and his rhetoric and the quality of his olives. Senators weren't just rich, they were ancestrally rich. They traced their lineage back to mythical wolves, conveniently overlooked their cousin's gambling debt, and wielded power with a smirk and a wax seal. Their wealth came from land. Their time was spent in politics, patronage, and long dinners where everyone pretended not to notice who got the best seat. They wore togas with a purple stripe so bold it practically screamed, "Ask me about my estate in Etruria." But senators weren't alone at the top. Enter the equestrians, or equites. They were the business class, the startup bros of Rome, minus the scooters, and plus a small army of accountants. They couldn't hold the highest political offices, but they controlled banking, trade, tax collection, basically the economic engine that kept Rome spinning and Lucius's wine flowing. Gaius Domitianus? He's none of the above. He belongs to the plebeians, the common citizens. Honest, hardworking, perpetually behind on rent, and the backbone of the republic. Plebeians could vote, own property, and occasionally rise through grit, luck, or impressively timed military heroics. Gaius dreams of that rise while kneading clay, humming songs his grandfather taught him, and wondering why his taxes keep going up when the streets still smell like fish. Below him, in the shadows, lived the freedmen, former slaves who'd been granted or bought their freedom. They weren't full citizens, but they could own businesses, marry, and even become wealthy. Many served their former masters, building quiet empires from bakeries, shipping yards, and suspiciously successful laundromats. They were the social middle finger to Rome's rigid hierarchy, living proof that status was a ladder, if you didn't mind some splinters. Claudia Tertia, she was still at the very bottom. A slave, property of the Fabius household. No rights, no wages, no freedom. Just labor, obedience, and the slim hope that one day, if fortune smiled, she might be manumitted. Some did, most didn't. But Claudia, sharp-eyed and quiet, never stopped noticing. Knowledge was her currency, memory, her rebellion. And then there were those Rome didn't even bother ranking. Beggars, vagrants, foreigners with no citizenship, and outcasts who lived at the edge of legality and pity. They existed in alleyways, under bridges, on the margins of frescoes. Rome, for all its pomp, was a city of inequality built with mathematical precision. Social mobility existed, but barely. A plebeian might rise through military service, a freedman might buy influence, even a slave, through sheer usefulness, might one day hear the words, "You are now free." But mostly, you stayed where you were born, and you learned to live with it, or make peace with dreaming. Class dictated everything: where you lived, what you wore, who you could marry, even where you sat at the games, the rich up front under shade, the poor in the back squinting sunburned and still louder than anyone else. Roman clothing screamed your status. Togas was for citizens, tunics for everyone else. Senators wore broad purple stripes, equestrians wore narrow ones. Slaves wore whatever was functional, flammable, or leftover. Claudia's tunic was clean, well-patched, and utterly unremarkable, exactly how her mistress preferred. Even food reflected class. Lucius dined on stuffed dormice, honey-glazed figs, and wine aged longer than most marriages. Gaius had bread, olives, and the occasional fish. Claudia, leftovers, if she was lucky, if not, bread crust and broth. But the most important social glue in Rome? Patronage. The rich acted as patrons to the poor, offering protection, legal help, or a bag of flour, in exchange for loyalty, praise, and very public appearances at the forum. It was a favor economy. You didn't rise by merit, you rose by proximity. Lucius had clients, dozens. Each morning they lined up at his door, greeted him with practiced reverence, and left with coins, tasks, or vague promises. Gaius once stood in that line hoping to get a contract to fix a senator's mosaic floor. He got 3 sesterces and a polite nod. It was a good day. Even in death, class mattered. Tombs ranged from marble monuments with poetry to shared graves with chipped tiles. Lucius had already commissioned his columns, inscriptions, a small statue holding a scroll. Claudia had no tomb, but she had stories. And sometimes that was enough. So tonight, as the city settles and the class lines blur beneath the stars, remember, Rome was built on inequality, but also resilience. The senator, the potter, the freedman, the slave, all lived in the same city, under the same sky, haunted by the same gods. Sleep well, little citizen of the mind. Whether wrapped in silk or straw, we all dream in the same language. And in the end, even emperors lie down in the dust. Tonight, we leave behind the marble halls of senators and the clay-streaked hands of potters to enter a different kind of empire, the empire of Roman family life. Because for all its legions, laws, and labyrinthine politics, the heart of Rome beat quietly in kitchens, courtyards, and cramped bedrooms, where the real power struggles happen between spouses, children, and the occasional in-law with opinions no one asked for. Let's begin where all Roman families began. The father, or more precisely, the paterfamilias. This wasn't just dad. This was the guy with legal control over everyone in the household until he dies or the gods intervene. He could arrange marriages, disown children, sell relatives into slavery, rare but legally possible, and decide whether a newborn deserved to be raised or exposed. Yes, infanticide by exposure was a grim reality. A child deemed too weak, deformed, or simply inconvenient could be left outside the city. Some were rescued, most were not. But in wealthier homes, like that of Lucius Fabius, such decisions were cushioned by layers of delegation and denial. Lucius ruled his household with the same calm authority he used in the Senate. Stern, distant, and prone to long monologues about virtue. His wife, Julia Calpurnia, managed the domestic sphere: slaves, meals, children, household accounts, and the social calendar, which required the diplomacy of a consul and the patience of a saint. Roman marriage was more alliance than affection. Women married young, often 12 to 14, to older men with political or economic advantage. Love was optional. Respect was expected. Divorce was legal and not uncommon. "I divorce you," said 3 times in front of witnesses, was all it took. No lawyers, just disappointment and maybe a burned tunic or 2. Women couldn't vote, hold office, or command armies, but within the home, a smart wife held enormous soft power. Julia knew every household secret, controlled access to her husband's ear, and could make or break a dinner party with one eyebrow raise. She couldn't change the world, but she could shape the men who did. Children were adored and micromanaged. Boys learned rhetoric on how to wear a toga without tripping. Girls learned weaving, modesty, and how to say "yes, dear" without sounding sarcastic. Toys were simple: balls, dolls, sticks shaped like chariots. Discipline was strict. Disobedience meant a lecture, a beating, or being sent to live with an uncle in the provinces. And then there were the slaves, the invisible members of every Roman household. Claudia Tertia, though young, managed the kitchen with quiet efficiency. She slept near the hearth, woke before dawn, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. She was part of the family, but never equal. Respected, perhaps. Trusted, occasionally. Freed? Someday, maybe. But not yet. Gaius Domitianus, though poorer, yet valued family just as fiercely. His home was a single-room apartment in a creaking insula, shared with his wife, their 2 sons, and a mother-in-law who insisted every cough was an omen. They ate together, worked together, argued loudly, and loved each other in ways that didn't need marble inscriptions to be real. Family life was filled with rituals. The dies lustricus, naming day for infants. The bulla, an amulet given to boys to ward off evil. The toga virilis, marking a boy's transition to manhood. And funerals, which brought out wailing, incense, and a sudden flurry of people remembering how close they were to the deceased. Romans worshipped their ancestors. Portraits of the dead lined the atrium. Names were passed down like heirlooms. To forget your lineage was to erase yourself from history. Lucius kept his family tree in a scroll chest, complete with exaggerated exploits and suspiciously heroic deaths. Women's lives were more restricted but not invisible. Wealthy women like Julia hosted salons, sponsored temples, and raised children who might one day rule provinces. Poor women worked, selling bread, weaving cloth, cleaning, nursing. Some became midwives or healers. A few, like Claudia, learned to navigate their status with quiet grace and occasional rebellion. And yet, despite its structure, Roman family life was full of contradictions. Fathers loved sons they barely spoke to. Mothers sacrificed for daughters married off to strangers. Slaves raised children who would one day own them. Families could be cruel, loving, fragile, or fiercely loyal, often all at once. Rome's laws might have declared men supreme, but inside the home, the true emperors wore aprons, rocked cradles, and made soup that could end wars. So tonight, as oil lamps flicker and lullabies echo through tiled halls and crumbling tenements, remember this. Rome wasn't just built by emperors and engineers. It was held together by families, messy, complicated, enduring. Sleep now, little heir of memory. The empire may rise and fall, but the laughter in kitchens and the stories whispered at bedtime, those last forever. Tonight, we slip out of the home, past the snoring uncles and the embers of the kitchen fire, to join the real heartbeat of Rome, entertainment and leisure. Because even an empire that ruled the known world needed to unwind. And when the Romans relaxed, they did it in a way only Rome could. Loudly, lavishly, and with a mild disregard for mortality. Let's begin at the Colosseum, the massive stone beast squatting at the center of the Eternal City. It wasn't just an arena, it was the arena, a monument to Roman engineering, ambition, and their unsettling enthusiasm for watching people bleed stylishly. But more on that in a moment. On the morning of a big show, the city buzzed. Senators, plebeians, freedmen, slaves, everyone packed into the amphitheater's 50,000 seats. It was a rare moment when the entire social hierarchy squished together, separated only by stone benches and the occasional death glare from a patrician who didn't like your sandals touching his toga. Lucius Fabius, of course, had premium seats, shaded, elevated, and with a view good enough to critique the footwork of a gladiator before his second swing. He came not just for the spectacle, but for politics, applauding at the right moment, cheering the right champion. It was all part of the game. One well-timed thumbs up could win you votes. Or wine. The shows were brutal, yes. Gladiators fought, often to the death, but not always. These were trained professionals, not wild prisoners tossed to the lions for fun. Well, not just for fun. They had names, fan clubs, endorsement deals for olive oil. A top gladiator was a celebrity, a mix between a UFC fighter and a tragic poet. Gaius Domitianus couldn't afford the good seats, but he didn't care. He stood in the upper tiers, yelling himself hoarse, throwing bread crusts, and placing bets he rarely won. It was the one place where he could scream at a nobleman without getting arrested. And the crowd? Oh, they were ruthless. They cheered blood, booed cowardice, and demanded drama. The Colosseum wasn't about justice. It was about release from taxes, from war, from the sheer weight of being Roman. But Rome didn't live on blood alone. For something lighter, you went to the theater. Plays ranged from slapstick comedies to tragic monologues that made audiences sigh dramatically. Masks were used, actors wore platform shoes, and plot twists came at you like runaway chariots. Claudia Tertia, on rare free days, once snuck to a comedy at the Theater of Pompey. She laughed, out loud, in public, and for a moment forgot she was a slave. That's what art does. It frees, even briefly. There was also the circus, specifically the Circus Maximus, where chariot races whipped the crowd into a frenzy of dust, speed, and betting scandals. Red, blue, green, white, these were the racing teams, each with its own fans, hooligans, and unpaid debts. Lucius preferred the blue faction. Gaius preferred whoever won. Claudia preferred the silence when the races were over and the city exhaled. But not all entertainment was public. Bathhouses. Yes, the Roman obsession. Not just for cleaning. They were the social media of the ancient world. You bathed, gossiped, debated politics, and sometimes closed deals while soaking in hot water. There were hot rooms, cold plunges, oil massages, and occasional thefts of sandals. A small price for civilization. Rome also loved festivals, and by loved, we mean they had one roughly every other Tuesday. Saturnalia, Lupercalia, Floralia, wild celebrations of gods, nature, and justified mischief. During Saturnalia, masters served slaves, gambling was allowed, and everyone wore silly hats. It was chaos, wine, and laughter, basically Rome on holiday. Music? Everywhere. Lutes, flutes, drums, and voices in taverns, villas, and streets. Poetry, recited aloud, sometimes in forums, sometimes by children who didn't understand it. Art on every wall, from detailed mosaics to surprisingly detailed statues. But beneath all the joy, there was tension. Entertainment was both distraction and control. Keep the people fed and amused. Panem circenses, and they won't question the corruption, the wars, the collapsing aqueducts. Lucius knew this. He played his part. Funded games, sponsored actors, smiled at senators who owed him favors. Entertainment wasn't leisure, it was strategy. For Gaius, it was survival, a place to laugh, cheer, forget. For Claudia, it was hope, proof that even Rome, in all its stern power, had room for joy. So tonight, as torches flicker and the last echoes of the arena fade into sleep, remember, Rome didn't just conquer, it performed. And in the grand theater of empire, everyone had a role, even if they didn't always get applause. Rest now, little spectator. The curtain falls, but the dream continues. And tomorrow, the crowd will roar again. Tonight, we trade the roaring arenas and wine-stained festivals for the quieter, more practical hum of daily life, Roman work and economy. Because behind every marble statue and grand temple was a workforce sweating, swearing, and silently judging their senators' spending habits. Let's begin with Gaius Domitianus, our ever-faithful potter. His day starts at sunrise, not out of discipline, but because the kiln doesn't care about your circadian rhythm. He shapes clay with hands that are equal parts artist and survivor. Every bowl, every oil lamp, every amphora might end up in a senator's cellar or shattered in a tavern brawl. Such is Roman commerce, unpredictable, dusty, and essential. Gaius rents his workshop in a busy insula courtyard. It smells of smoke, garlic, and occasional ambition. His tools are simple, passed down, patched up. His customers range from innkeepers to temple priests. Prices fluctuate with grain costs, weather, and whether the latest gladiator scandal distracted the market. Rome's economy wasn't capitalist, but it wasn't clueless. It thrived on trade, taxes, and labor, the kind that didn't get weekends off. There were three major types of labor. One, slavery, Rome's backbone, brutal, normalized, and omnipresent. Two, freedmen, often skilled tradesmen, running businesses while navigating a society that still looked down its aquiline nose at them. Three, citizens. Some worked with their hands. Many managed things. Most hoped someone else would do the dirty jobs. Lucius Fabius, for example, doesn't work. He administers. He owns land, rents it out, and collects grain through a manager who occasionally forgets how numbers work. He profits off trade routes he's never walked and ships he's never boarded. To him, money is an abstraction. To Gaius, it's the difference between dinner and debt. But Lucius isn't lazy. His job is to stay powerful. He invests in shipping ventures, finances public games for image, and arranges marriages like hostile takeovers. His wealth flows not from sweat, but from leverage, and really good sandals. Let's talk about markets. Rome's forums weren't just for speeches. They were buzzing hives of trade. Meat, vegetables, wine, garum, fish sauce that smelled like betrayal, fabric, tools. Anything and everything was sold beneath the shadows of temples. Prices were haggled. Deals were sealed with handshakes and muttered oaths. And if something went wrong, good luck suing someone who fled to Hispania. Trade made Rome rich. From Britannia's tin to Egyptian grain, from Syrian glass to Indian spices, Rome was a shopping mall wrapped in stone and ambition. Goods came in by ship, cart, and very tired donkey. Warehouses along the Tiber stored everything from wheat to perfumes so strong they gave senators headaches. Money came in coins, mostly silver and bronze. Gold was rare, prestigious, and largely used by people who didn't trust bronze to hold value, which, to be fair, was a reasonable concern during certain emperors' reigns. Claudia Tertia, she didn't handle money, not officially, but she understood its weight, how many hours a slave's back cost, how much silence was worth. She saw what things were really valued: loyalty, discretion, and knowing when not to drop the amphora with imported honey. Many Romans worked in guilds, collegia. Bakers, builders, barbers, even mourners had associations that set prices, trained apprentices, and occasionally threw parties that ended in very professional brawls. Gaius once considered joining the Potter's Guild until he realized their dues were higher than his monthly income. And then there were the farmers, the unsung empire. Most Romans lived off the land. They grew grain, olives, grapes. Some were tenant farmers, some slaves, some free, but always one drought away from disaster. Rome's granaries were full because someone somewhere woke up before the sun and hoped the wheat didn't rot again. The economy was built on cycles: harvest, market, tax, repeat. Taxes were collected in goods, coin, or labor. If you couldn't pay, you begged a patron. If your patron failed, you prayed. If the gods failed, you joined the army. Entertainment, temples, armies, they all needed funding. And funding came from work. Not glamorous, not poetic, but crucial. Rome's glory stood on tired feet and calloused hands, and yet ambition stirred everywhere. Freedmen bought property, merchants funded temples, even Gaius dreams of expanding his shop, hiring help, retiring with enough coin to never touch clay again. Claudia dreams too, not of wealth, but of choice, a market where she picks her own fabric, a room with a door, a life where her labor is hers. So tonight, as the markets close, the wine shops sweep out the drunks, and the potters put their tools down, remember this: Rome's power was visible in its palaces, but it survived in its workshops, fields, and kitchens. Rest now, little laborer of the mind. Tomorrow brings more coin, more trade, more sweat. But for now, let the empire rest on your dreams. Tonight, we step beyond coin and kiln, beyond temples and tribunals, into the realm of Roman communication and travel. A world of echoing messengers, clattering hooves, and the occasional message delivered via angry goose, probably. Because before Twitter, before emails, before postal delays made you question reality, Rome had its own version of the information superhighway, the actual highway. Let's start with the roads. Yes, the Via Romanae, straight, stone-paved masterpieces that stretched across the empire like veins through a very ambitious body. They connected cities, ports, forts, markets, and yes, gossip. Built by engineers with both skill and borderline OCD, these roads were so well made that parts of them still exist today, outliving half the empires that came after. Lucius Fabius, of course, never walks on these roads. He rides in a litter, carried by slaves, while discussing senatorial business and occasionally judging how bumpy the road feels through his cushion. His letters, important, official, and always wax-sealed, are sent by Cursus Publicus, Rome's state-run courier system. Think FedEx if every delivery man also carried a sword and wore sandals. The Cursus Publicus was fast. Well, Roman fast. Messages could travel up to 80 kilometers a day with relay stations. Mutationists providing fresh horses and fresh scroll bearers who hopefully didn't read the drama between senators along the way. It was reliable, if a bit sweaty, but not everyone had access to this imperial luxury. Gaius Domitianus, for instance, sends messages through traveling merchants, cousins, or a neighbor who knows a guy. News takes days, weeks, or never arrives. When it does, it's usually smudged, tear-stained, and slightly sarcastic. Claudia Tertia doesn't write letters, she remembers things. She passes news in whispered words over market stalls, in laundry rooms, at doorways. Information moves through Rome not just in scrolls, but in glances and gossip. And Claudia? Claudia is a library with ears. Rome was obsessed with information. Forums buzzed with announcements. Wall graffiti delivered everything from political slogans to gladiator fan mail. Public criers shouted the day's edicts, court results, and which senator just got caught bribing someone under the statue of Jupiter. Again. For the educated, reading was a mark of class. Lucius kept a library, not huge but carefully curated. Scrolls from Greece, treatises on law, philosophy, and the occasional steamy epic disguised as moral instruction. He reads with a finger on the line, lips slightly moving, as was common practice. Silent reading, suspicious behavior. Education mattered. Wealthy boys learned Latin, Greek, rhetoric, math, and how to insult politely. Girls, if lucky, learned to read and write too, though society preferred they master embroidery and passive resistance. Teachers, often freedmen, taught in rented rooms or outdoors, yelling over street vendors and the occasional goat. Discipline was persuasive. Wooden rods did most of the talking. And then there's travel, the glorious, dusty, time-consuming dance of moving through the empire. On foot, horseback, chariot, or sea, travel in Rome was for soldiers, merchants, officials, and people who didn't mind sharing a ship cabin with livestock. Lucius might travel to his estates in Campania, a few days by road, complete with escorts, baggage, and a servant whose only job is to remind him which sandals are clean. Gaius has never left Rome, but he's heard tales of mountains in Dacia, deserts in Africa, frozen rivers in Britannia. Claudia once followed her mistress to Baiae. She saw the sea, tasted salt in the air, and wondered how many cities existed beyond the horizon. For a moment, she wasn't a slave. She was a traveler, brief, fleeting, but real. Inns along the road were functional. Beds with straw, stew with mystery meat, and owners who pretended not to hear bar fights. Roads were safe-ish, thanks to patrols and harsh laws against banditry. But travelers carried knives and prayers just in case. Rome didn't just build an empire, it connected one. Roads, letters, spoken word, each tied the provinces to the capital. A general in Germania could send a report to Rome in days. A merchant from Alexandria could arrive with spices, news, and scandal. A whisper in a market could start a rumor that reached the Senate, and what traveled even faster than people or parchment? Ideas. Religion, politics, fashion trends, jokes, they moved on ships in camps across borders. The toga didn't conquer the world. Conversation did. So tonight, as the couriers rest, the inns creak, and the last letter is sealed in wax and hope. Remember, Rome's power wasn't just in its legions, it was in its connections. Sleep now, little messenger. May your path be straight, your sandals sturdy, and your gossip accurate. For in this empire of stone and scroll, every voice is part of the story. Tonight, we fold the map, extinguish the oil lamp, and walk hand in hand with history into the final corridor of our Roman journey, decline and legacy. Because every empire, no matter how mighty, eventually looks up at the stars and wonders where all the cheering went. Let's not sugarcoat it. Rome fell. Slowly, awkwardly, like a rich man tripping over his own toga. There wasn't one single bang moment, no curtain drop, just centuries of crisis, patchwork solutions, and emperors who increasingly resembled warning labels rather than leaders. Lucius Fabius, now older, more silver than senator, watches the cracks appear. Grain shipments arrive late. The forum is quieter. The whispers in the Senate grow more bitter. Barbarian tribes, once distant threats, now make headlines. And the tax collectors? Hungrier than ever. Even as a state in Campania feels less secure. Bandits roam, letters go missing, trust wears thin. The military, once Rome's pride, is stretched too far, paid too little, and increasingly filled with foreign recruits who respect Rome's gold more than its gods. Legions no longer march with discipline. They mutter, they desert, they mutiny. Gaius Domitianus, still working his kiln, sees the change too. His clay arrives later. The streets are filthier. More beggars, more soldiers, less laughter. People hoard, not share. He tries to raise his sons right, but even they ask if Rome's glory is real or just something the rich carved on monuments. And Claudia Tertia? She's free now, technically. A modest stall, a rented room, a name of her own. But freedom in a collapsing empire is like a raft on a sinking ship. Better than drowning, but still wet. She teaches younger girls how to listen, how to learn, how to leave when it's time. So what happened? Corruption, overexpansion, civil wars that made soap operas look mild, economic collapse, plague, environmental strain, leadership that rotated faster than Laundry Day, and eventually invasions from Goths, Vandals, Huns, tribes the Romans had once mocked, now sacked their cities and danced on their dreams. In 426 CE, the Western Roman Empire officially ended when Romulus Augustulus, a teenage puppet emperor, was deposed. No grand speech, no final battle cry, just a signature and a shrug. The Eastern Empire, Byzantium, limped on for another 1,000 years, but the West, it had fallen. But did Rome truly die? Not really. Its legacy lived on. In roads still walked, in laws still quoted, in languages that sprouted from Latin like rebellious teenagers, French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, Portuguese, in architecture, philosophy, religion, in how we organize cities, how we debate politics, even how we flush toilets. The idea of Rome outlived the city itself. Medieval kings called themselves Caesar. Popes crowned Holy Roman emperors. Renaissance thinkers copied Roman sculptures like they were limited edition collectibles. Even today, we still look back, not because Rome was perfect, but because it was human. Glorious, flawed, funny, proud, tragic, just like us. Lucius's villa crumbles, but its foundation remains. Gaius's pottery shatters, but the shards tell stories. Claudia's name fades from scrolls, but echoes in the resilience of women who survived history's silence. Rome fell, yes, but it also seeded the world. So tonight, as the stars blink over ruins and ghostly columns, we say goodbye, not with sorrow, but with understanding. The empire ends, but the story goes on. Through you, through us, through every whispered bedtime tale about a city that once believed it could rule eternity. Rest now, little citizen of history. The legions sleep, the temples wait, and the Tiber still flows. And if you listen closely under the hush of night, you might still hear it. Roma Invicta. Rome. Rome, unconquered. Good night. Before we dim the lights for good tonight, let's take a moment to talk, not as storyteller and audience, but as fellow time travelers. If this journey through the Roman world stirred something in you, if you laughed, learned, or even just whispered, "Oh wow," at least once, then I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment below. Tell me which moment lingered with you. Was it Claudia's quiet defiance? Gaius's dusty resilience? Lucius trying to stay relevant while Rome crumbled like stale bread? Your thoughts aren't just feedback, they're part of the archive. This channel isn't just a place for stories. It's a community for curious minds who like their history with a side of sarcasm and soul. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Not out of obligation, but because you want to be here when the next story begins, whether it's pyramids or plague doctors or a medieval breakfast that should have stayed in the past. Thank you for staying with me through every scroll, sword, and soup made from questionable ingredients. Sleep well, traveler, and I'll see you next time for another tale from another world just before bed.